Natsuki Subaru, protagonist of RE0, is a divisive character. Glaring flaws, frequent missteps, social faux pas, Subaru walks a path rather distinct from your average isekai hero. These shortcomings can make him a bit infuriating for the audience, at times even unsympathetic. The inspiration for today's video actually comes from the very last scene of Season 2's first half, which consists of Oto punching Subaru in the face, something many of us have wanted to do at one point or another. Subaru's characterization is something of a sticking point for a lot of people. Perhaps the show would have been even more popular if his flaws were more endearing, or his excesses more palatable. It certainly would have been a safer play. Most series work really hard to make the protagonist sympathetic to viewers, to get us invested in their well-being, cheering on their goals. It's often observed that being obnoxious is a greater sin to the audience than being an actual villain, because while the evil, unspeakable acts of a bad guy are fictional, the feeling of being annoyed at a character is painfully real. Did our storyteller make a mistake then? Was Subaru supposed to be likable and they just dropped the ball? Is it just a matter of taste, with Subaru simply not everyone's cup of tea? Or is he saddled with some unflattering qualities on purpose? What if giving us a main character we rather dislike at times is the intent? What if that is actually kind of the point? I confess it's hard for me not to assume that the ugly and annoying parts of Subaru are there to serve a certain purpose, because this work depends on the characterization of the protagonist to a degree that most shows do not. Yes, virtually every story with any substance will feature characters that grow over time and have their share of shortcomings and mistakes. That's normal. But the key structural element of RE0 is return by death, a time travel mechanic that resets the world with no one wiser save for Subaru. Thus, what he believes or feels or does is the sole discrepancy between different outcomes. As he changes, so do the possible futures. And this puts a focus on his characterization that is way more pronounced than in the majority of stories. And now, knowing this, why would you create frequent moments that cause the audience to lose faith, or have secondhand cringe? Why not instead give us endearing little idiosyncrasies that we can sometimes play for laughs, and other times see him correct, never to trouble us again? Just little temporary hurdles we can watch the character overcome so we can feel that accomplishment vicariously. We want a character to be flawed, but not too flawed. With the way the series puts so much emphasis on Subaru's characterization, why would you give us such a messy person? Unless there is actually a method to your madness. This video has been created on the assumption that there is, in fact, a method here. That Subaru's contentious characterization works hand in hand with the other things the series is doing. If you glance at the length of this video and were wondering if this whole long thing is really about Natsuki Subaru, then the answer is, sort of. It is a character analysis at its heart, but not only that. And so, here is a kind of too long, didn't watch thesis/summary. Natsuki Subaru is a complex and often realistic representation of someone who struggles with insecurity. That includes the defense mechanisms, the seemingly contradictory behavior, and related conditions such as egocentrism and low self-worth. His characterization is also the vehicle to explore other subjects. One of these is how RE0 can be read as a criticism of the isekai genre, but perhaps also a criticism aimed at the isekai audience, as Subaru possesses some of the same qualities and the same unhealthy ways of coping. There is thus some focus on insecurity itself, and the series allows the audience to experience the point of view and the isolation of those who suffer chronically. It also shows how personal hardships are echoed in others, and how that commonality can be key to understanding and aiding other people. And it is, in totality, not an indictment of the insecure, but an illustration of what not to do, and perhaps what instead can be gained. We are perhaps not used to this combination of genre and characterization. We do expect a complex cast and nuanced progression in melodramas, in series that look like they are grounded in reality and whose narratives are driven by character interplay. And likewise, we expect somewhat simplified characterizations for fantasy or action, where personal foibles are often just sources of conflict to be overcome in the same way as plot complications. However, Since I think RE0 is going after self-insert power fantasies in general, and the isekai versions in particular, bucking that trend feels highly appropriate, even if it is a bit risky. Thus, I think RE0's surface presentation of a story about Subaru searching for a path toward the future is only part of the puzzle. To achieve that future, I suspect the key thing Subaru must find is himself. By the way, I'm Theta with an 8. This is nearly on red. I didn't have a tracksuit to wear in Subaru's honor, so this is the next best thing. Here's some quick info about the video because it's a long one. It is organized into 7 main sections, most with subsections. While it is not a walkthrough of the plot, the first 3 sections do largely concern the first season, and the next 3 concern the second, though references will be made in both directions. Despite this, it is structured around ideas that build off one another, and so is not meant for skipping around. There is then a final 7th section to tie some things together, one of which is us, the audience. This video contains spoilers for the first and second anime seasons, as well as the 2 OVAs Memory Snow and The Frozen Bond. There are no spoilers from the source material, the shorts, even promotional material such as previews. I do not even read source works. My anime analyses thus far are constrained to the text of the animation itself. I go to great lengths to protect myself from spoilers. We do the same in our little Discord and Twitch communities. I thus ask you to likewise refrain from making any leading or spoiling comments on this video, and that includes from Season 3 onwards. Thank you very much. Let us begin. Insecurity and Isekai. So then, to understand Subaru and how he has acted at each stage of the journey, we need to go all the way back to the beginning. We must return to 0. While the series does a lot of things which intentionally break from the isekai mold, it is ultimately an isekai, and so the story begins in earnest with the summoning into another world. What happens just before that is so short and seemingly inconsequential that it's easy to forget. In retrospect, though, Subaru's reaction to being in a new fantasy setting, his first attempts to interact with others, and the way he thrusts himself into the events around him are all a bit deceiving. They gave us an impression of Subaru that has turned out to be at odds with the impression he has of himself. For although we do occasionally hear Subaru's thoughts, he is not actually narrating. Right before Subaru is given the isekai treatment, we find him in a convenience store browsing manga. He will look up from his reading to notice a young couple strolling past, oblivious to all else. They're almost certainly around Subaru's age, and he does not fail to notice them. But he will look away from the happy twosome at his own reflection in the store's window, as he stands there, alone, reading manga at a convenience store late at night. He sighs dramatically. Back to reality, or so he assumes. When he is outside and the impending isekai transfer warps the world around him, he'll at first think his eyes are playing tricks, a consequence of playing video games all day. But the young couple we saw moments before were in school uniforms. It's probably a school day, and so for him to have played games all day means he isn't in school. That late-night run to a 24-hour convenience store is also a well-understood trope of shut-ins, as doing so avoids as much human interaction as possible. Combining all these little observations around Subaru paints a certain picture. A stereotypical hikikomori otaku, someone hiding from the outside world, and perhaps a little envious of those who are succeeding in it. Now that the second season has given us insight into his past, we know that the picture built from this brief scene is accurate. Subaru was exactly the kind of person that the isekai genre tries to appeal to. Now, those who have watched my streams have heard me mention this a lot, so for you, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I want to talk about the allure of the isekai concept for some of its audience. The usual pattern is that someone from our world, who is often unremarkable or even an outcast, will then end up in some other world where they thrive. The reasons why they thrive may vary, but the appeal is that unspoken implication. These characters were unexceptional or even losers in one world, but not in the other, which means the determining factor wasn't the person, but the environment. They were never really the unremarkable outcast, it's just that our society didn't value them in the same way. So if you are someone who similarly feels left behind by circumstance, or feel like you are on the outside looking in, or simply feel like you don't fit or matter, well, a story in which a character just like you can prosper in a different scenario is pretty inviting. Rather than look inward to effect a change, one looks outward to dream of changing the setting entirely. It's not me that's wrong, it's the world that's wrong. And the standard isekai formula indulges that idea with gusto. Now, don't mistake me. Isekai is absolutely not alone in creating power fantasies or self-insert characters to let audience members imagine themselves in a more interesting circumstance. And that technique is practically as old as fiction. Where Isekai carves out an important distinction is the choice of main character, someone from our world and not the realm in which the story takes place, and usually someone already failing in some way on Earth who then succeeds in the new environment. It's therefore unsurprising that a common criticism of the genre is how its victories are unearned. Success is often just handed to the main character, as they typically bring or are given some huge advantage as part of the setup, teeing them up to, well, to play the hero. But in stories, as in our real lives, we find it more satisfying when someone earns their happy ending. Instead, the unspoken moral of Isekai is that you are only a failure because your setting deems it so. Were you to find yourself transported elsewhere, things would be different. It's this world's fault, not your own. There's nothing you need to change about yourself. So, like I said, Subaru is exactly the kind of person that such stories appeal to, and he is quite familiar with it. He assesses his situation, a fantasy world with typical medieval-style culture, and he assumes that certain isekai staples are sure to follow. Yet, one after the other, his expectations fall short. He does not discover hidden ability to save the child from the carriage. He does not suddenly become an invincible fighter when confronted by the thugs, and he does not manage to do, well, even mundane things, walking into the wrong bar and the wrong restroom, and failing to secure even a single appa for food. He will bemoan this disconnect rather directly. Where'd my protagonist status go? He'll even criticize his starting gear, by which he means the little bag from the convenience store that got summoned along with him. I'm sure compared to something basic like a short sword or some leathers that a level 1 in an RPG begins with, a bag of snacks seems like a raw deal. Had he been more self-aware, he'd realize the significance of only being supplied with some convenience store munchies. It wasn't this world that gave you that sad starting equipment. You brought such shortcomings with you. Finally, he will demand to know one more missing isekai staple. Where is the cute girl that summoned me? While the universe seems to be toying with him one more time when Felt shows up and just as quickly leaves, an actual answer seems to materialize when Emilia comes on the scene. She'll save him from his predicament, but turns out to be in a predicament all her own. And on this point does Subaru's story really begin. Here indeed is a cute girl, half-elf and magical, something that doesn't exist in the world from whence he came. If he can latch onto her, then the lingering possibility of a real isekai adventure is still alive. Like Don Quixote appointing a stranger to be his lady love, so long as certain patterns remain the same, Subaru can convince himself that he is in a particular kind of story. There is another way that RE0 departs from a normal isekai setup, a mystery I've wondered about from nearly the beginning and only now have an answer for. You see, in basically every other non-reincarnation isekai, one of two things happen at the beginning of the story. Either we see why someone has been summoned to another world, or solving the mystery of why they were summoned becomes a driving goal. No one ever just finds himself in another world, apropos of nothing, and just runs with it, but that's just what Subaru does. So, what kind of person reacts this way? Subaru will never mention his life before he found himself summoned. He'll never talk about his family. He'll never even give a hint that he wants to return. The only time he even speaks of his homeland is just another example of him trying to follow the isekai script, describing his origin as an island nation to the east. And not even this goes to plan, as Lagunica turns out to be the easternmost nation. And yet still, Subaru does not clue in that he is not in that kind of story. Or perhaps rather, he doesn't want to clue in. But thanks to witnessing Subaru go through the first trial, we finally got to see why Subaru was so eager to embrace the change of scenery. He doesn't come from an abusive or neglectful household, or any other crisis situation that might explain his silence. This series does not go for the tragic backstory trope, excusing his shortcomings because he was a victim himself. Instead, Subaru's crisis was a struggle with who exactly he is supposed to be. We'll learn that his father is well known and someone he idolized, someone he aspired to emulate. Yet in his own quest for distinction, Subaru finds himself coming up short. He excelled at school and sports when younger, but less and less so as the years wore on. As he says, what used to be his best grew smaller and smaller. No longer the center of attention for his success, he seeks attention for his shenanigans instead, doing wilder and dumber things. It was in hopes that his friends would believe that they couldn't have this much fun if they weren't with him. But over time, this too failed to work out the way he wanted. While still on Earth, he actually gets an opportunity to reinvent himself, his high school debut. But having no experience with real relationships, and perhaps the pressure he feels to reverse course, he seems to overdo it. Social skills are like any other skills. You need practice if you want to excel. Realizing he blew this chance to start from zero in his high school world, the dread of returning each day builds and builds on him until he eventually stops going. Yes, this is no solution. He'll certainly never live up to his father's example by staying at home, but the longer he scorns school and society, the harder it gets to make a change. During the trial, he'll confess that he really wanted his parents to tell him they didn't love him, to throw him out, to snap him out of the increasingly destructive cycle he had found himself in. It seemed he'd given up on sparking the change in himself. He had failed twice already to mix things up. Surrendering that agency to someone else externalizes responsibility for taking action and lets him excuse himself from vigorous self-examination and improvement. In other words, he took the path of least resistance rather than looking inside. In that state of mind, being yoinked into an isekai fantasy is practically a dream come true. No one in this world knows the ways he has failed before, and so he can try to build a new image for himself. No one in this world knows his father either, and so there is no fear of the comparison. In fact, this is a chance to avoid bringing him up at all. His summoning is a chance to redo his high school debut all over again, but without any pressure. And of course, there is the usual isekai pattern, which says that as the summoned protagonist, he is going to soar to great heights. The appearance of Emilia is enticing for its potential, and once he discovers that he really did gain some kind of power, the chance to be the guy who saves the day and wins the girl must seem tantalizingly close. The chance to be someone other than that sighing reflection in the convenience store window. But, well, the problem with Subaru's dream is that he's the one having it. He is that guy going for gas station food in the wee hours after playing video games instead of school. He is the guy who wants to be the popular kid but has shunned social activity. He is that guy who has delusions of grandeur but has stopped putting in the work to get there. And that reality is why RE0 is the kind of story it is. Who Subaru is as a person does not change simply because the world around him did. As I've said, Subaru is insecure, but that descriptor fails to capture the effort the series has made to characterize him. He is a much more complex portrayal of low self-worth or damaged self-esteem than we might be used to. Often, an insecure character is portrayed as a mopey, withdrawn type, a shrinking violet, someone who stops short of ever doing or saying the things they want. Or we get the opposite, someone who covers their insecurity by being braggadocious, aggressive, the personality version of a paper tiger. In reality, insecure is more complex and pretty widespread. Everyone has at least some moments of feeling inadequate or unsure about their worth. It doesn't often inform one's entire personality, but just peeks out in odd places. But for some, this is not true. Insecurity is an ever-present monkey on their back. This doesn't mean they fail to develop personalities, though, or only developed those simplified caricatures of always hesitant or always blustering. They still have things that make them laugh or cry. They still interact with other people. They have dreams and fears and preferences. They have tendencies towards how they experience failure or success. The difference is that many aspects of who they are become tainted with a fear of never measuring up. Thus, a more realistic portrayal of poor self-esteem will likely manifest in lots of different ways from the same person. One might brag at times to create a confident-looking front. One might be prickly to keep others at a distance. One might even bully others to bring them lower and make one feel better by comparison, or perhaps extol how refined their taste, how sophisticated their preferences. Or they will always self-sacrifice, putting others ahead of themselves to an unhealthy degree because they don't value themselves. Or withdraw from others entirely, avoiding situations that make them feel inadequate. And one is very likely to crave those moments when they are praised or treated kindly, a salve to hold against their wounded inner selves. But throughout all these behaviors, we find this common thread, an underlying preoccupation with the self. How they even relate to others is dependent on how others impact them or how they assume they are perceived. Those with poor or damaged self-image often struggle to see beyond the immediate horizon of their own circumstance. Counterintuitively, then, those with insecurity are often also those with ego. Their pride is especially important to them because it needs constant tending and mending and defending. The insecure thus often exhibit signs of egocentrism. While calling someone egocentric is usually a way of accusing them of extreme selfishness, it's really more about an inability to correctly account for the perspectives of other people. This can result in overestimating how widely one of your opinions is shared by others, such as thinking that because you like a particular thing, surely most everyone else does as well, right? That kind of presumption might fit what we think of when we say egocentric, but this so-called false consensus effect can also go in the other direction. If you have a low opinion of yourself, you might assume that everyone else does as well. If you think your desires are relatively meaningless or unimportant or too selfish and so on, then believing others share that opinion can lead to the withdrawing, self-censoring, or self-sacrificing behavior we associate with some of the insecure. There is, in fact, a stage of child development known as adolescent egocentrism. It's called such because it begins in adolescence, not because everyone passes through it before adulthood. It's not a problem or misstep, but rather a critical part of developing one's identity. There's two aspects of it I want to mention, and they will sound familiar to anyone who has exited childhood. And if you haven't exited childhood, well, what are you doing watching this long, talking head video anyway? Aren't you bored? Well, if you aren't bored, let's continue. The two adolescent egocentrism concepts to mention are called the imaginary audience and the personal fable. Imaginary audience is easy enough to understand. It's a pervasive belief that others are constantly watching, scrutinizing, and judging. We feel eyes on us even when no eyes are present. This can amplify the effects of peer pressure. For some people, it means acting out or taking risks due to perceived expectations, and for some it means withdrawing from others to avoid those expectations or due to increased anxiety, or both, because adolescence is fun that way. Personal fable is a belief that one's experiences and the accompanying thoughts or feelings are particularly unique. So unique that no one else could understand them. And since one's experience is singular, then the advice or warnings that come from others do not really apply. Your fable is personal. You are the main character. The imaginary audience already makes you believe you are in the spotlight, and so that must mean you are the star. This can lead to feelings of hyper-uniqueness or invincibility, or believing one has great power or ability. As such, you may not be surprised to learn that the Personal Fable Wikipedia entry has Chunibyo as one of its 4 related articles. But this misconception of personal uniqueness does not just give rise to delusions of grandeur. The moments when such daydreams make contact with reality can be humbling, devastating. Believing that one's thoughts are singular also means believing one's failures and inadequacies are theirs alone, that no one else can understand or relate or help. Considering Subaru's trial again, then, we can see some of this at work. He believed he was special, as his father's son, uniquely smart and fast, and struggled when his personal fable departed from actual events. The repetitive scene of indistinct, shadowy others saying, "You're definitely his kid," obviously affected him a lot, and it fits that idea of the imaginary audience. Subaru had a false idea of the kind of scrutiny he lived under, and a false idea of who he was supposed to be, and they impacted him at a critical stage. You might perhaps think of egocentrism as a shortage of empathy, being unable to put oneself into someone else's perspective, or having difficulty considering their opinions, their desires. Understanding the way someone else thinks can lead to being kinder or more considerate of them, which may be how we normally think of being empathetic, But when suffering from low self-esteem, understanding how others perceive you may lead to you being kinder and more considerate of yourself. However, one of the key ways to develop empathy is associating with other people, to understand how they think firsthand, and how they are both different from and similar to oneself. The insecure, though, can run into problems here, where their insecurity prevents them from associating with others at all, or getting past their own worldview long enough to internalize a different perspective. It becomes a feedback loop between their low self-worth and their egocentrism, making it more difficult to move beyond either. So, I say all of that in hopes that we can better understand some of the behaviors we observe in Subaru. He has little experience with intentional empathy, and so struggles to understand how others think. His more troubling tendencies, and the difficulty he has in facing them, have roots in his insecurity, his low self-worth, and his egocentric worldview. I thus want to track this perspective on Subaru throughout the story so far. Alongside that, we'll explore my notion that RE0 is critical of a pattern in isekai stories in which someone becomes successful purely through a change in setting, and perhaps critical of those in the audience who allow themselves to indulge in that fantasy. But I want to clarify, I don't think the series is a rebuke of people who struggle with self-worth or self-esteem. Insecurity is not a moral failing. Several people in the story world have similar issues, and the treatment of their plight is sympathetic. Rather, the series may be criticizing those who would rather ignore such an issue, and criticizing stories which indulge escapist fantasy over self-improvement. It's not assigning blame, but urging self-examination. There's a saying in the therapy world, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. But before we get that lesson, Subaru must first try and fail to take the usual isekai route. Rise and fall of the fantasy. Although I've spent some time talking about Subaru's flaws and having some fun at his expense, he is not composed entirely of shortcomings. For one thing, he is not the kind of person who deals with low self-esteem by belittling or bullying others. Though he does keep most people at arm's length, he doesn't accomplish this by being hostile or intractable, but is just reluctant to show his more vulnerable side. He puts on a mask to project what he perceives as his best foot forward, not as a malicious attempt to deceive. He's basically a good kid who is still a kid, with strengths and weaknesses and identity still madly in flux. Even as he tries to follow the script he thinks he's the star of, you'll still see some of his good points come out. In the first arc, after he realizes he's time looping whenever he dies, he has a moment to entertain a change in plans. Nobody saved him in this new timeline, and so he is not really obligated to get involved. He could sell his phone as Emilia, and then use the seed money and his modern education to carve out a luxurious new life for himself. Now that we know how disappointed he was with his high school life, it's even more understandable why this was a temptation. But further consideration about what kind of person would get involved in his troubles, even when she didn't owe him anything, will cool his enthusiasm. He knows what will happen if he does nothing. In fact, he's the only one who knows. Can he really ignore that outcome? Will he think only of himself when someone is in trouble who has that capacity for kindness? It turns out he can't just look away. Something similar will happen in the second arc when Subaru is at one of his lowest points. The people he was trying hard to befriend turn out to be the ones killing him. And this too gains new context for us, as it must seem an all too familiar betrayal to the Subaru who thought he was the ringleader of his childhood friends, only to one day realize he was all alone. He will again have an opportunity to walk away from it all if he allows Betty to help him escape with his new life. And he will again realize that he was shown unselfish kindness by these very two he is considering leaving, as he figures out they tried to comfort him when the nightmares held him in sway. So, just like before, he decides he must get involved, for their sake rather than his own. It's worth noting that the loop proceeding from each of these decisions are also the ones in which he succeeds. Succeeding, though, is a bit of a mixed blessing. His involvement in the first affair with Elsa and the stolen insignia will lead up to saving the lives of Emilia and Felt and Ronji. This gets him taken in by the very girl he has designated his main heroine, and he wakes to plush surroundings, under the care of twin maids who seem like they were ripped straight out of the wish fulfillment playbook. Subaru's doubts about being in that standard medieval fantasy isekai are understandably diminished. Even though Subaru has some good instincts and qualities, he nevertheless is an insecure adolescent willing to believe the fanciful promise of being ushered to a happy ending by his new circumstances. He wants that personal fable. We'll see him try to steer events towards the direction he thinks they are supposed to go, following the script that he assumes belongs to him. One amusing example is after he and Emilia are alone a few days into his stay. He gets the opportunity to use the line, "Tsuki ga kirei desu ne?" The moon is beautiful, is it not? This phrase is somewhat idiomatic in Japan, an indirect way of expressing love towards another. It's romantic in a roundabout Japanese way, and would be an appropriate line in the romance subplot that he wants to believe he's found himself in. But after Subaru dies and that night gets wiped out, he'll try to force the same scenario again when he and Emilia are alone, except they are indoors, and there is no moon in sight for him to be referring to. This upsetting of his expectations plays nicely for humor. The next example, though, is so disastrous that even we in the audience shudder to remember it. This is really the key moment for how I read what the show is saying about Subaru's insecurity and the wider tendencies in the isekai genre. Subaru will declare himself Emilia's knight in front of basically every real knight in the kingdom, as well as every other candidate for the throne, as well as, well, basically anyone who's anyone. He'll even brush aside Emilia's attempt to stop him because he's made up his mind too, as though his own resolve was the only thing that mattered here. The other knights made bold declarative statements about their favored lady. Surely he must rise to that challenge. In a classic chivalric storybook tale, Subaru might have the right idea, but he is not in that kind of story. This then leads to the disastrous duel with Julius, the breaking of the promise with his gate, and the fight with Emilia, where he seems for a moment to have lost it all. But I want to point out that this multi-part disaster is not purely due to his delusions of grandeur, of taking a fantasy too far. It has a clear root in that deep-seated insecurity. You can trace it rather neatly in the events that lead up to his humiliation. It starts when he and Emilia have come back to the capital, walking around with joined hands as Subaru tries to get in touch with those who helped them out before. The topic of Reinhard absconding with Felt will come up, and Subaru will muse over Reinhard, thinking, hot guys have really got it good. Even though Subaru's involvement saved Emilia originally, Reinhard was the one who got to play the dashing knight, a role that Subaru no doubt covets. He knows he doesn't measure up, but it's hard to be sore at such a genuine nice guy like Reinhard. Fortunately, or unfortunately, a substitute target for this jealousy appears on the scene when we meet Julius. Emilia will let go of Subaru's hand when Julius appears, something Subaru does not fail to notice, and she will follow that up by allowing Julius to kiss her hand in a classic knight and lady display. And Julius is every bit the knight, in all the ways that Subaru is not. When Subaru is left behind by these two to wait with the shopping while they go somewhere that he is not important enough to follow, well, that underlying sense of inadequacy comes boiling back to the surface. Julius is that kid who won the race instead of Subaru. He's the kid with the high score in the class instead of Subaru. Subaru is coming up short. His best seems smaller and smaller. It builds so much that when Emilia comes back out, Subaru fixes on her male companion in a transparently jealous way. Even Al, who is literally just meeting Subaru, cannot fail to notice his insecurity, pointing out that he's more worried about losing her to another man than happy to see her. So, how does Subaru deal with coming up short in the past? The same way he does here. He makes a spectacle of himself in the selection assembly, and he downplays the importance of knighthood in the same way he eschewed competing at sports or school in his youth. And when it doesn't work out the way he hoped, just like the high school debut, he once again withdraws from the world, hiding out at Cruz's manor as he busies himself with sword practice, an escape in this world as surely as video games were in his life before. The crises of the first two arcs involve Subaru dealing with external threats, Elsa in the theft of the insignia, and the girl we now know as Mei Li in the attack on the village. The crisis of the royal selection comes entirely from within Subaru. If he listens to Emilia and stays away, then none of the disaster occurs. It's self-inflicted. But the mounting insecurity he felt through the previous day, and the need to shore up his bruised ego, leads him to put her wishes aside and travel to the palace anyway. Now, to be fair to Subaru, the way his power works means that he needs to be involved in any trouble to be able to overcome it. As he'll say, he's only of any use when something happens. If he doesn't know what goes wrong and doesn't die because of his proximity, then there is no second chance to alter the outcome. But that is only enough of an excuse to explain his travel to the castle. He actually lets his real thoughts peek out when speaking to Rema before. I can't stand not being involved in Emilia's important affairs. He has added himself into her story without invitation. In fact, he has done so over her request that he remain with Remu. She explained to him at the time that she can't bring an outsider into this, but Subaru has already decided that he is not an outsider. That very idea fills him with inadequacy. He's the protagonist, not the guy who waits outside with the groceries or stays home twiddling his thumbs while Emilia does important things with other, more important people. What Emilia wants from him doesn't factor into his decision if it conflicts with what he wants. That's how he can justify his trip to the selection, and why he can make a fool of himself even after Emilia tries to get him to back down. It's why he can use his gait in the fight with Julius, breaking his promise just in defense of his own pride. And it's why it all goes sideways in the conversation with Emilia afterwards. She is even giving him the benefit of the doubt at first when trying to figure out how he ended up fighting Julius. There must have been a reason, right? Knowing you, it must have been important. But it wasn't. Subaru just wanted to get him back. Julius made him feel pathetic, powerless, unworthy of Emilia. In fact, Subaru has felt inadequate around Julius since they first met. He'll even explain that the look he is shooting him in the throne room is the look that you throw a rival. But Julius isn't his rival. He's Anastasia's knight. This is just another instance of Subaru's egocentrism. He made assumptions about Julius without taking any time to understand him or what he wanted. What's more, he has done the same thing with Emilia almost since the beginning. In their shouting match after the duel, he will claim that his actions were all for her sake, but she'll call him out on this untruth. She never asked him to do any of those things. What she did ask him to do was to wait at their lodging with Rem, and not to use his magic because it might endanger him. Those are her actual wishes, but he couldn't respect them because of how it made him feel to be left out, and how it clashed with his own perception of his role. How it would make Emilia feel was secondary at best, and at worst, never even crossed his mind. Hasn't she ever seen an Isekai story before? He's supposed to defy convention and save the day, emphasizing that he was really a winner all along. Doubts about him or his involvement are just a setup for him to prove everyone else wrong. And she's supposed to forget whatever else she was doing with her life before he entered it, or whoever else she considered friends or allies. And if she was competent or powerful before, she's supposed to become helpless and dependent on him now, right? She's supposed to be grateful to him, a gratitude that then builds into romance. Subaru shows quite the ugly side of himself as their conversation goes on, but it's not just a reaction to her exposing his selfish motives. Subaru is having his whole understanding of their situation challenged. His presumption about how Emilia would take his words doesn't only originate from his ignorance about her, but from his idea of how their relationship is supposed to function. Perhaps he's never much thought about how little agency the heroine demonstrates in all those isekai fantasy, how little attention is paid to what might be going through her mind, and how rarely such a heroine might challenge the hero over what drives him, and how rarely the hero has to put in any effort to grasp what must be a wildly different worldview. For indeed, Subaru has very little understanding of Emilia the person. He has put her on a pedestal rather than trying to learn what she wants and why she asks the things she does. She is an ideal to him rather than another flawed mortal like himself. The tragedy here is that Subaru had a real advantage coming into this. Because he's not from this world, he doesn't have any bias against half-elves, nor does he have any fear or suspicion towards spirits, allowing him to build instant rapport with Puck, the closest person in the world to her. He saved her without knowing how important she was or that she had a rich patron, so there is no ulterior motive to suspect him of. Subaru is uniquely positioned to be someone Emilia can really be close to, but he's been chasing the idea of her instead of just getting to know her. Part of it is because of what he assumes their roles should be, and part of it is his social inexperience. And of course, a part of it is that insecurity and resulting egocentrism. He defaults to thinking of her in terms of what he wants or how she makes him feel. It's something that he does with everyone. Perhaps then you can see why these episodes where Subaru makes a fool of himself are key to how I interpret what the story is doing. Up until this point, the Isekai script is still plausible. Despite some early humor where it doesn't go exactly as Subaru thought, he has nevertheless traveled down a familiar path. He gained an extraordinary power. He managed to save the day, twice. He has a heroine he is pursuing, and a literal maid complete with costume recently added to his harem. He's made friends with powerful, important people in this sword and sorcery setting. He's met 3 of the 5 candidates, as well as all 5 of those backing them. He must feel like he is just a step away from being the same kind of important, well-known, and well-regarded person that he considers his father to be. But despite all the success and his meteoric rise, Subaru has made no real inner change. Return by Death allows him to brute force his way past roadblocks. The Subaru that Rem ends up loving is the same Subaru that she killed. He simply got enough do-overs to alter the outcome. It is that isekai pattern in microcosm. He changed the circumstances rather than himself. It all shatters rather neatly when Emilia leaves him and their conversation exposes some of the ugliness within. I think it is incredibly significant to what the story is doing that he never gets a chance to redo any of that. That shameful display is the longest stretch of episodes that never got rewound in the story to that point. Return by Death, that could have been used by our storyteller as the ultimate manifestation of the isekai conceit, where Subaru changes the circumstances over and over again until he succeeds, without ever changing a thing about himself. At the selection, though, he manages to make a spectacle of himself to the largest group of important people he could possibly have managed. The imaginary audience became a real one at the worst possible time, and his isekai protagonist status does nothing for him. If anything, the disaster is only as bad as it is because he had so many things work out to get him into that position. Subaru is just like any number of shut-ins or others with insecurity who have retracted from the world. He can fantasize about saving the day and winning the girl and all that, but if he stays in his room, he'll never have to face what it's like to try and fail, to really put his ego on the line. He can be the victor in 100 video games, imagine himself the hero in 100 light novels, dream 100 dreams of his own splendor, and as long as he doesn't step outside, those possibilities remain intact, unchallenged. The illusions shape themselves to fit his form. The sequence of events that has actually happened since we got summoned to another world, though, led him to a place where he could suffer something far worse than blowing his high school debut. Return by Death is conspicuously absent as a solution this time around. And it's a good thing, too, or he may never have made progress. That he gets no chance to retry that disastrous day is perhaps argument enough that the series challenges the isekai mold for main characters, but in case it isn't, we have the 3rd arc to really drive the point home. 3rd Arc Crucible. Subaru licks his wounds for a few days, able to hide out, largely thanks to Emilia's efforts to see him taken care of. He's well aware that he has made a mess of things, but what to do next? Introspection? Soul-searching? Well, Felix makes a comment about his sword practice with Wilhelm that makes it plain that even others can tell Subaru is avoiding such things, though at least the sword play is a form of self-improvement. Reinhard will also show up to try imploring Subaru to make amends with Julius, but Subaru will have none of it, is even annoyed at Reinhard for not minding his own business. Subaru isn't interested in admitting fault. His ego took a serious blow, and he doesn't have the confidence to cope with such an injury easily. Putting his effort into something unrelated like sword training and avoiding Julius are things he hopes will keep him from ruminating on the disastrous selection day, but the memories intrude all the same. When Wilhelm gets the best of him, he will find himself being attended to by Rem, and with her, at least, he lets some of his worry out. Rem, You don't think I'm pathetic? She doesn't give him baseless reassurance, but agrees that he is. Subaru can't understand, then, why she would still be there with a pathetic loser like him. Part of why he fears inadequacy is his belief that it drives others away. If others knew how incapable he was, then surely he'd be abandoned and isolated like in his childhood. So he really doesn't understand Rem when she says that the fact that I think you're pathetic and my staying with you are not contradictory. It's a shame his fear of being weak leads him to try to hide his vulnerability from others and to avoid facing it himself. Had he really understood Rem's words, he might have been spared a lot of pain. Unfortunately, Subaru is the type that needs to learn the hard way. During a surprisingly casual conversation with Kruja the next day, Phyllis will try to give him advice that is taken the wrong way. Phyllis suggests that Subaru figure out what he can do to make up with Emilia and to do it. Rather than self-examination about what he may have done poorly, Subaru concentrates on what he can do well. He realizes that there is something only he can do, return by death, and that prospect pleases him, perhaps excites him. It's a path to redeeming himself for his recent failure. No need to reflect on how he got to this position if he can move past it instead. This change is noted by Wilhelm the next day. He can tell Subaru has abandoned getting stronger with the sword, and so it is pointless to keep at their practice. Subaru is not interested in self-improvement any longer. He is just waiting for an opportunity to use the power he's been granted to smooth things over. He is, effectively, hoping for a crisis, a chance to save the day so that all will be forgiven. Sure enough, something is wrong at the mansion, and despite the warnings from Kruja and Phyllis, Subaru decides that they will try to intervene. Now, it's not Subaru's decision to try to save the mansion that's the problem, of course, but rather the delight he feels at the opportunity. The potential to be the savior outweighs the concern he should feel that someone needs saving in the first place. He is thinking of himself. He'll even proclaim that the moment he isn't around, Emilia gets into trouble, as though she hadn't lived her whole life to this point without either of them knowing the other existed. It's a completely self-absorbed viewpoint, but potentially lets him off the hook from the need to change. The Isekai script again seems within reach. Perhaps Subaru even visualizes the hero moment that surely will be his to grasp. But the story does not reward him. It's quite the opposite. It was downright arrogant of him to believe that he could be the answer to some problem he doesn't understand. When he finally arrives, too late, he must walk through all the gruesome evidence of this arrogance. A village destroyed, butchered children, and precious Rem cut low even as the words of her letter ring in his ears. The castle is no better, with Rem and a disfigured Petra clasped in death, and then Subaru finds his own death with a final message from Puck suggesting Emilia's fate. You're too late. While Subaru had seen some death to this point, he has been the main victim of violence. Felt and Emilia and Rem all died in previous loops, but in a considerably cleaner way than this slaughter. The scale and visceral quality of the cultist attack is a step above whatever had come before, as though the universe itself was smacking him down for his casual temerity. He actually will connect his selfish desire for a crisis to the scope of what has happened, protesting that this wasn't what he wanted. He just wanted a little crisis for a chance to use his power, a chance to make the problem of the embarrassment go away. Unsurprisingly, this affects his mental state, and he begins the next loop in a bad way. It works in his favor as far as getting his wish to return to Emilia, and I am tempted to read this as more than just happenstance. I have no doubt he was shaken by what he saw before, and a little mental breakdown is believable. However, Betelgeuse, of all people, will question exactly how broken Subaru is. His insanity is far too sane, he says, and accuses Subaru of putting on his madness. Frankly, I trust Betelgeuse to be the expert in judging a broken mind. Subaru retreating into a state of dissociation is just another way of avoiding reflection or dealing with the guilt he feels at having wished for the crisis that he just witnessed. It's like in his past, when he wanted someone else to snap him out of it. He externalized the responsibility for his direction. It's another variation on the idea that it's not his fault, leading Subaru to choose self-pity over self-reflection. Subaru is content to play the victim in this loop rather than the hero, but the results are the same, perhaps even worse. Seeing Rem killed rather than finding her later is a hard burden to bear, made all the more tragic for her using her last moments to confess to Subaru and her last strength to free him. Despite her efforts, though, the mansion result is the same, and Subaru must again witness the crisis that he wished for before dying himself, Rem's sacrifice in vain. On the third loop, Subaru still does not look inside. Instead, he externalizes the blame to Betelgeuse, lets his attention and anger focus on him. Again, understandable that he would be enraged after what happened to Rem, but very convenient that a single-minded fixation on the cultists enables Subaru to let himself off the hook yet again. This time, at least, he doesn't have any illusions that he and Rem can solve things themselves, and yet, when attempting to secure aid from Kruja and later from Priscilla and Anastasia, he again doesn't try to understand what other people want. He never stopped to consider how any of the things he asked for or assumed should happen would be taken by those he entreats. What's most telling about these exchanges isn't the outcome, but that Subaru was surprised by them. His desire and anger were strong to him, so of course they should matter to others, right? That is the personal fable idea in action, misperceiving that other people find your emotions and desires as important as you do. Even the fact that he is asking candidates for help doesn't strike him as odd, despite these being people who directly benefit from Emilia's troubles. So, of course, he comes away empty-handed, and of course, it all goes poorly in new and even more horrible ways. Rem erased from the world, Emilia dying in his arms, and Puck dressing him down before setting out to destroy the world. Each of these 3 time loops unfold the way they do because of Subaru's state of mind. While they seem quite different, all have the same source. They are each ways that Subaru's insecurity manifest. The first was delusions of grandeur, of fantasizing that he would be heroic and victorious, and that this would eclipse any personal shortcomings. The second was retreat and self-pity. Subaru surrendered agency and any blame along with it. And the third was anger and the externalization of fault, fixating on outside wrongs so as to avoid examination of the inner wrongs. These defense mechanisms are no stranger to those with low self-worth, and all have in common that egocentric point of view. For Subaru, what he feels or wants are the things that matter most in the world. Yet, because he fears to stare too long into the mirror, these desires are confused, jumbled, contradictory. What's more, he cannot reconcile his worldview to that of others, which repeatedly leads him to misunderstanding and disaster. He has met the enemy, and it is him. The story may have thus proceeded very differently, save for a certain blue-haired maid. In the loop after Emilia dies in his arms, Subaru is still running away from the crux of the problem. This time, though, he intends to run away in a literal sense, and will commit another transgression. He knows how Rem feels about him thanks to the previous loops, and attempts to leverage that to have her run away with him. Even if he's fleeing, he doesn't want to be alone, and this is his next desperate play. This is not a good look for Subaru, for those of us who know how he really feels. It's easy to have our opinion of him drop still lower in this scene, especially since Rem doesn't know that she confessed to him in a previous loop, and that he is taking no risk by propositioning her. Yet, think of why Rem is even here in the first place. Subaru doesn't really understand the full extent of why his words and actions were so important to Rem, as only we got to see her past. Thus, it wasn't something he did for his own gain, but it also wasn't arbitrary. It was authentic on his part. He wanted to save her and Ram from the sorrow he'd seen before. He wanted to help make them whole, even if he didn't really know what that meant. His good deeds thus end up saving him in turn, and it's precisely why Rem is beside him at his lowest point. And make no mistake that Rem saves him. The From Zero episode and exchange between Subaru and Rem, it could be its own video, so I'm going to try to limit this to the most significant points. One of these is how Rem responds to Subaru's offer that they run away together. Subaru asks her to flee with him, proposes a direction, a rough plan, but throughout his explanation and her questioning, he continually turns it into something he is doing because he feels he has no other choice. He can't do anything in the capital, but he can't do anything if they go to the mansion either. He didn't want to believe it, but no one ever needed him, and that's why they can't stay here. He's sorry it's sudden, but now she has to choose, him or someone else. What he is saying to Rem, in effect, is that he doesn't feel like he has any other options, so he guesses he'll run away with her. Not that it's his first choice, not that it's what he wants the most, not even an attempt to persuade her that he is doing it out of affection or something he spent time considering or anything except that he feels desperate and he wants her to be his crutch. There is no authenticity here. Thus, Rem's answer, I think, is critical. I doubt it's something she wanted to do, but she lays out her own imaginative idea of what it would be like to run away and make a life with him. And it's thorough, it's detailed, it's heartfelt. And the more she goes on, the more Subaru becomes distressed, because the authenticity of her wish exposes how disingenuous his own request was, how selfish and callous it was. For here is something meaningful to her that for him was just the least worst option he could think of. Subaru is consistently failing to consider what other people want or feel, but in this instance, he cannot help but realize that what Rem wants was far more than he had taken into consideration. It is to his credit, at least, that it shames him. Ultimately, Rem could not take him up on his offer because it would be leaving the part of him that she loves most behind. It would be Subaru giving up, and as she'll say to him, it is easy to give up, but it doesn't suit you. She'll insist that despite how he is acting, he hasn't really given up on anyone, that he doesn't stop halfway through. But Subaru does not agree, for he is burdened now by the weight of inadequacy he feels, the shame of his thoughtless request, and the multiple traumatic failures he recently experienced. And so, in this state, he finally drops the last bit of mask that he had been wearing the entire time he has been in this world, and we learn how he really feels about himself. Now, it's not like this is the first time that Subaru has shown a vulnerable side or admitted to having struggles. There's a second arc where he will be in enough obvious distress that Emilia will basically drag him into a room and insist that he put his head in her lap, or the scene we've mentioned when he is lamenting about how pathetic he is while laying his head in Rem's lap. Dude likes laps, no judgment here. However, both of those moments can be attributed to momentary setbacks, the worry he had over getting the curse attack, or the embarrassment he felt due to the selection disaster. When he breaks down here, though, he is not referring to how he feels in a temporary, fleeting way. He is indicting his entire being, the trajectory of his life to this point. It's raw. Rem is praising him, insisting he is one way when he claims that he is another, and so he snaps. What do you really even know about me? I have no strength, but I want it all. I have no knowledge, but all I do is dream. And then he admits the depths of his low self-worth. He hates himself. All he does is talk a big game. What did he do before he met all of them? Nothing. He's never done a single thing. Images of that brief introductory scene in the convenience store will be interspersed in his rant, then, suggesting it was representative of his life. He'll bemoan the fact that he had all that time, all that freedom, and never did anything with it. This is not Subaru having a bad day, but Subaru revealing the depths of his self-loathing. It's how he's felt all along, the whole time we've known him in the story, but, like I said at the beginning, his behavior gave us the wrong idea, exactly as it was supposed to. He admits that assuming he could do anything at all was arrogant from one who has accomplished nothing. He decries his laziness, his wasteful habits, and the way he tries to cover up these weaknesses, referring to both the sparring with Wilhelm and Rem's efforts to help him study. He wasn't actually trying to get better, it just gave him something he could point to so he could say that he was trying. He is empty. And I'll be honest, I can't help but feel that some of this self-indictment is pointed at the audience. Dreaming instead of doing, wasteful habits, spending free time towards no end and yet wanting more. Self-loathing, but covered over with big talk, or going through the motions of self-improvement. Even a light familiarity with anime is enough to know the overlap that has with portrayals of its fandom. Stereotypes, sure, but I suspect ones pulled from reality. To such, then, Subaru's following line may be uncomfortably familiar. At heart, I'm just a small, cowardly, filthy piece of trash who's always worried about how others see me. And what's more, he says, nothing about that has changed. New world, fresh start, supernatural powers, magical friends, exciting adventures, all the isekai trappings, and yet our protagonist realizes he is fundamentally the same. He's not a loser in our world, but a winner in this one. he's the same loser with a different coat of paint. RE0 is taking the seductive lie of Isekai and holding it underwater until the bubbles cease. Like I said, Return by Death could have been the ultimate escapist power if this series wanted to go in that direction. Infinite do-overs mean you don't ever have to learn or self-improve. You can just trial and error your way to the happy ending completely unearned. Instead, Subaru never gets a chance to redo the embarrassment of the candidate selection, and his many attempts to stop the attack on the mansion haven't just ended in failure, they've made him feel increasingly like a failure himself. The only thing that is different in each time loop is Subaru and the choices he makes. As he seems to get further and further from success rather than closer, well, what other conclusion should he reach? The problem with his dreams is that he's the one having them. And so he lays it all out. All his insecurities and all the contradictory ways he's behaved because of them. And getting it off his chest is not enough, really. But luckily for the story, and for Subaru, Rem is more than just a sounding board. She counters his low opinions of himself with praise, counters his list of failures with a list of successes. As she says, all you know is yourself. How much do you know about the Subaru that I see? Those who have dealt with insecurity long enough lose perspective. They fall short in some way, and this leads to a pervasive doubt in themselves, which can create new shortcomings and new doubts, and on and on. Redma does not give him abstract platitudes or empty rhetoric, but specific, tangible things he has done for her, small gestures or habits of his that she loves. Subaru feels phony and empty, and so Rema lists things about him which are genuine, authentic. Subaru had been trying this whole time to figure out how to play the hero, and yet without trying, he had become hers. It's a moving speech, and though Rema doesn't manage to capture Subaru's heart, I dare say she captured some of the audience. Subaru responds to her outpouring in a way that, at first blush, might seem downright cruel, the now infamous line, "I love Emilia." But it's actually the opposite. Being straight with her here is a mark of character. He had started their conversation proposing that they run away and make a life together, a fake wish with little consideration of Rem. Now he speaks truly of how he feels, hiding nothing from her, giving her no false expectations. To do less would be downright insulting to the woman who laid her own heart bare. What's more, it's a sign that her words have reached him. He loves Emilia, and so he will indeed keep trying. He becomes the thing that Rema had just said she loved about him, someone who can smile while they talk about the future, someone who doesn't give up. It's the way this episode ends that then really puts a bow on how RE0 distinguishes itself from many other isekai. The full English title is RE0 Starting Life in Another World. And back at episode 1, the starting life part, we assume simply means the isekai transfer. He ends up in another world with just the clothes on his back and the bag of snacks, and must restart from nothing, right? Instead, though, the From Zero episode ends with Subaru declaring that my life in another world starts here, from zero. Up until this point, Subaru was dragging his old self with him. The setting changed, but he hadn't. There was no starting anew for Subaru in the way that really mattered. But now there will be, even if it's just uncertain first steps. If this still wasn't convincing enough, the situation in the story immediately improves. The universe rewards Subaru for the change he is trying to effect in himself. He aligns the interests of Kruge and Anastasia and Russell Fellow, critical growth that he thinks in terms of what other people want instead of what he wants. He puts aside his protagonist syndrome, stops acting as though he is the center of the world. Where before he had been imagining using Return by Death to save the day and thus earn forgiveness, he now takes on a considerably muted role. In the White Whale attack, he assumes the humbling position of decoy. He has no illusions about being the warrior who brings the whale down. In fact, he doesn't take a weapon of any sort with him into battle, despite having practiced swordplay with Wilhelm for days. Later, he must overcome his wounded pride to work alongside Julius, and ultimately will suggest the strategy that brings down Betelgeuse despite having to bond with Julius to do so. Importantly, he goes to great lengths to hide his involvement from Emilia in the final loop, using her own magical cloak and intermediaries like Ram and the kids to obscure himself. It stopped being about averting the crisis because of how it benefited him, and started being about averting that crisis because of the people who suffer if he doesn't. Subaru's good deeds will not go unheralded because something, again, happens unexpectedly. When they figure out that Emilia's carriage is holding the explosives, some quick action is required. The recently saved Oto pairs up with Subaru to race to the rescue. Because of this, Subaru gets the very hero moment he had originally coveted, but without any intention on his part. He gets a perfect opportunity to confess to Emilia how he feels, a dramatic race against the clock to save the day, and the most important reward of all, ending up with his head in Emilia's lap. Wait, no, I mean he gets to make up with Emilia, admitting both his fault in their last discussion and the truth of how he feels about her. Rem's own rescue of Subaru at his lowest point becomes a guiding example for him now, as Emilia will also have a list of objections for why Subaru shouldn't feel the way he does. She's a silver-haired half-elf, many people hate her because of how she looks, she doesn't have much experience with people and is naive, she's doing this for a selfish reason, and so on. Emilia has her own share of issues that we'll return to, but for now, Subaru has stumbled his way to a happy moment because he looked into changing himself instead of merely being content with changing worlds. Maybe he's not the level 100 legendary hero he thought he would be by this point, but at least he's no longer level 1. What's more, he is now positioned to be a much better ally for Emilia. The Subaru who made his embarrassing proclamation at the candidate selection did not really understand Emilia's situation. As he said, he was really just drunk on the idea of doing it all for her. It has taken his eye-opening dealings with the other candidates, the advice of the Appa vendor, and his time trying to make sense of Betelgeuse for Subaru to really grasp just how friendless Emilia is in this world. She needs real allies going forward. The world will not default to her side. But she also needs understanding, which Subaru is at least a little bit better equipped to provide. Rem's words reminding him of the genuinely good and worthy things about him means he can more easily put aside his ego. Countering Emilia's self-doubt as he does suggests he has learned the value of this lesson. Hearing Emilia's objections about herself and feeling himself unmoved, perhaps Subaru can understand what Rem had told him before, that finding someone pathetic and yet remaining with them is not contradictory. With time, he may be able to imply that even to himself. Subaru can more readily look outward when he feels more at peace with what he finds inward. That makes him no different from you or me. We can better take care of others when we take care of ourselves. Unfortunately, Subaru does not get long to enjoy their success, as the ripping away of Rem will yank the rug out from under his newfound confidence and capability. And this, too, I find an accurate way to illustrate insecurity, and really any kind of self-perceived flaw. We're used to stories treating characterization struggles like plot points: met, overcome, left behind. In reality, humans struggle with the same things repeatedly. Multiple attempts at rehab to beat an addiction, yearly efforts to start dieting or exercise, the same fights with the same people on different days. Knowing the issue and working on it aren't the last steps in the process. When someone in an isekai wields a weapon or magic for the first time and masters it, we know that's fantasy. And character progression should be no different. There is, too, the potential for skewing the audience's expectations of themselves. If your only examples of overcoming personal struggle are characters who get it right on the first go, how much worse do you feel when you screw the same things up repeatedly? Understanding how normal that is leads to greater self-compassion. Because I believe RE0 is intentionally holding a mirror up to its audience, I also find this choice a wise one. It is one of many examples of audience awareness. And so, as we begin to discuss the events of the second season, let's first look at how Return by Death helps immerse the audience in what it's like to feel insecure. The vicarious weight of failure. I want to start this section by saying that time travel isn't real. Please do not gasp in alarm. It's not a real thing that stories can be about, in the same way that a story could be about, say, warfare, or a specific war, or the consequences of being in a war, and so on. We do not need artists to explore the impact of time travel on our societies, because there is none. This means that time travel is instead a storytelling device. It is doing something specific for the story. Sometimes it can be a way of obscuring and then revealing a mystery. Sometimes it can be a way of reversing misfortune without erasing character decisions. Sometimes it can be used for humor, since comedy relies on the unexpected, and time travel shenanigans are outside our everyday experience. There are thus different kinds of time travel to suit whatever purpose they serve for a story. Whether or not you can travel physically in time, whether forwards or backwards or both, whether changes to the past update your world, spawn new timelines, result in stable time loops, whether or not certain things happen regardless of what you try to change, whether or not the future is changeable at all. It all depends on what time travel is doing for the particular story in which it's found. In the case of RE0, the time travel of return by death is what's known as a Groundhog Day loop. Someone is rewinding and reliving their life from a specific point, and whatever happened since the last time they rewound basically never happened, except that the looping character remembers. This is one of the cleanest types of time travel and is thus a popular variant. Unfortunately, just mentioning that a story has time travel is potentially a spoiler, so I'm not going to list other examples, but there are some very popular and well-regarded anime series that utilize this particular time travel style, so all I'm about to say will apply to them as well. The Groundhog Day loop is very effective for emphasizing characterization, something I mentioned back in the introduction. The looping character will have the option to try new things based on previous outcomes, or may try new things because their own outlook or priorities have changed, or simply as their state of mind is affected by what they are going through. Since the setting and the characterization of everyone else stays the same, the changes of the time-traveling person are highlighted by contrast. They are the only variable. And one thing that almost always happens to characters who loop in this manner is that they become increasingly isolated. Each rewind means another set of memories they acquire, which are shared by no one else. Each new experience puts them further from the person they were before they began to loop. They are increasingly a stranger to their former selves and to everyone who knew that self. Suffice to say, this is not a good place for someone who already has trouble connecting with others. It's also quite difficult for those with insecurity, but as a storytelling device, it has the fantastic upside of allowing us to experience that sense of inadequacy in a vicarious way. Here's what I mean. Subaru has a pattern of underestimating his value in the eyes of other people. Thanks to everything we've seen, the audience is also likely to underestimate the way Subaru is perceived by others. Audience members may even scoff at those who accept him, that it all seems very convenient that these other capable people would put up with this adolescent loser. The return by death mechanic means we experience the worst sides of Subaru, his mistakes, regrets, his self-sabotage, yet the other people in the story only remember whatever happens during these successful loops. The impression they have built of Subaru is very different from the impression he has built of himself, and we have experienced that less flattering look along with him. The story has thus given us a way to understand the dichotomy between what a person thinks of themselves and what others may think of them, an inner person and an outer. We retain in our mind all the failures and bad behavior of Subaru that are unknown to most everyone else around him. The insecure likewise remember all the stupid things they've done, all the moments of self-doubt, all the embarrassment over mistakes or delusions. They feel like imposters, as though any minute now, everyone will out them as a fraud and treat them like the person they see in their own minds. Subaru has actual failures to remember, but the insecure often have a host of imagined failures, pessimistic fantasies in which they fall short or are ridiculed that might as well be just as real for them. They are too long in their own heads and have essentially built a different reality that they inhabit. You might even say they are living in their own fantasy world, have isekai'd themselves into a realm where they can never be the hero. Remember how Rem cuts through Subaru's litany of self-hate. How much do you know about the Subaru that I see? And the answer is nothing. The Subaru can't see what he means to others because the vision he has of himself looms too large. There are several instances. Rem, obviously, which I don't think we should completely rehash here. And she is also, though, an example where we in the audience have a greatly expanded context for her feelings because we get to see her whole backstory, and Subaru does not. How Rem feels towards Subaru does not originate entirely with him. Her circumstances put him into position to be the one who says something meaningful for her at the right place and the right time. Similar example of this is Wilhelm. We also get to see his backstory with Teresia, while Subaru does not. All Subaru knows about her is their brief exchange when they first meet, and Wilhelm's explanation about her loving flowers and being loved by the sword right before the battle with the white whale. Subaru therefore cannot appreciate the impact he has on Wilhelm when he says, "I believe you were able to do this because you loved your wife like crazy." Wilhelm apparently neglected to tell Teresia how he loved her in life, and she was taken from him too soon. He thus punishes himself by not going to visit her grave, and focuses his purpose on slaying the white whale that took her from him. The very moment that the whale is dead, he shouts out that he loves her. Bittersweet, as it cannot make up for all the times it went unsaid in the life that they shared. Perhaps Wilhelm's quest was even partially to prove that he really did love her. So when Subaru, who doesn't know any of this, suggests that the depth of Wilhelm's love is what carried him through, it's validating in a way that Subaru cannot realize. Wilhelm is basically ride or die with Subaru from then on. It should be no surprise that he wouldn't entertain Felis's idea to break up their alliance, not even for a second. These two examples are a nice reversal of the limited point of view we normally have in the story. Rem and Wilhelm have a positive impression of Subaru that he cannot fully appreciate. We in the audience get to step outside Subaru's narrow viewpoint to better understand how he may come off to someone else, and by extension, how anyone could underestimate their esteem in another's eyes. The conversation just before Subaru makes his comments to Wilhelm serves as another example of the disconnect we get to experience alongside Subaru, and this time with Kruja. She will call him the hero who brought down the white whale in a passing comment about the look on his face, and at first, he doesn't even process what she said. Hero? Me? She'll further explain that she isn't going to take credit for his success, and Subaru will comment that her opinion of him has improved a lot. His expression says it's all quite unexpected. She will even invite him to join her household, though it's a foregone conclusion that he will still back Emilia. He's quite moved by what she says here, and the earnestness with which she clasps his hand. And I imagine this is why he awkwardly avoids shaking her hand at the beginning of Season 2, after she has forgotten that this exchange took place. The important part of their post-whale conversation is his comment about her opinion improving. He remembers her rejecting his request to aid against the attack, and the promise that they would become enemies if he left then. And he remembers her accusation that he must be involved with a witch's cult to know what he does, or that he was doing all of this for his own sense of revenge and using Emilia as an excuse. He may even remember her asking Rem, "How can you give so much of yourself for Natsuki Subaru?" He holds in his mind the ways he has come up short or been rebuked by her, even if things have turned out well for this moment. But from her point of view, Subaru went from a guy moping about her household and playing at swords to the one who suddenly had assembled a plan and allies to strike against the white whale. Further, he provided inspiration on the battlefield, giving them a point to rally around when morale was low, someone pressing onward even without a weapon to call his own. And he's the one who comes up with the ultimate coup de grace, baiting the whale into the path of the tree. Kruja has the well-being of the kingdom in mind, and Subaru is the unlooked-for gift that helps her lift a great burden off the people that she hopes to rule and protect. In that light, how could she hold his embarrassment at the candidate selection against him, or not be understanding of the 3 days he hung his head afterward? Those are a rather small thing against the way he just improved the lives of those in the kingdom. Yet, because we share Subaru's point of view and remember what a long path he took to get here, we might also miss how he must seem to Kruja at this moment. Subaru is also surprised that Otto helps him when he's imprisoned by Garfiel. He even asks point blank, and then laughs at himself for being an idiot, when the answer was as simple as Otto considering him a friend. Subaru remembers things like when he yelled at him for forgetting Rem, or when Otto shoves him out of the wagon in hopes of surviving the whale's attack. But this Otto's first interaction with Subaru was when he freed him from the Iron Fang's captivity and cleared his suspicion as a witch cultist. Then Subaru proclaims that he won't let the crazy shadow spider version of Betelgeuse get to him, and he offers to introduce Otto to Roz, to aid him in his business as a trader. He thanks Oto for staying with Emilia when Garf attacks them. For all that Subaru gives Oto grief, it's understandable that Oto would feel a kinship there. He is something of a familiarity for Subaru by showing up in so many loops, and so I think it's also understandable that Subaru cannot separate out the version of himself that may live in Oto's head. And even if he could, he may not be able to correctly guess how positively Oto views him. What does he know about the Subaru that Oto sees? Subaru will be surprised by all the villagers attempting to help him escape when Garfiel goes on his rampage. He'll be shocked Oto pushes him out of the way, and that Patarasha tries to aid him despite being wounded. He seems surprised when Ram helps out. He can't fathom why Betty would save him and no one else. He doesn't understand Petra's reaction when she gives him the handkerchief and is suddenly bashful, and on and on. The Subaru's version of himself is quite different from the versions other people see, and the story is set up such that we in the audience get to share a little bit in his bewilderment. We also have a different image of Subaru than exists in the minds of the other characters. For this purpose of immersing us in Subaru's core insecurity, then, the distasteful way he comes off to the audience is actually critical. It's part of the method to the madness. Annoying us and frustrating us makes us less likely to view Subaru as sympathetically misunderstood. We don't read the things he says about himself as mere self-deprecating humor. When he says he's weak and pathetic, we say, yep. This uncomfortably familiar proximity to his uglier side helps us appreciate why Subaru's insecurity influences so much of his behavior. It's critical to understanding how he gets himself into crisis in Season 2. New season, new hurdle. If I can oversimplify a moment, in Season 1, Subaru must stop trying to be the hero. In Season 2, he must stop trying to be the martyr. Subaru experienced a huge setback to his confidence and progression when he learns what has happened to Rem, and discovers that he is powerless to reverse it. That was only the second time Subaru killed himself on purpose, and both times were in hopes of reversing her death. When the second attempt doesn't work, he becomes understandably paranoid that he will lose someone else in an irreversible way. This leads him to spending his life rather recklessly as the full situation in the sanctuary becomes clear. It all seems like a natural enough progression, yet in retrospect, we can see how Subaru's increasingly desperate path was guided by external forces. He is an effective target for this manipulation, though, because of how his self-worth, egocentrism, and social inexperience interact with return by death. We'll first examine the situation he gets himself into, then go back and consider how others intentionally exacerbated his tendencies. So, like we said in the previous section, characters experiencing a Groundhog Day loop will inevitably become isolated from everyone else. Their mental selves continue forward, grow, and change, while everyone else is frozen in time at the point where events rewind. The longer the series goes on, and the more times Subaru returns by death, the greater this divide can become. Fortunately, that whole by death part has mostly kept Subaru from leaning too hard on his ability. The series does a good job of never turning the requisite deaths into a mere inconvenience. Subaru feels the pain and trauma of each end, and does not seek to die to turn back the clock unless something transpires that is worse to him than that trauma. He was deeply affected by not being able to reverse Rem having her name eaten, so when he learns that the mansion is being attacked, it must surely seem like another such nightmare is threatening. He's going to lose Rem permanently, and the other three besides. To his mind, that is far more painful than facing his repeated demise. After his first few attempts to navigate the crisis fall short, he decides to fall back into the tempting solution of return by death. Sure, he has to die, but he learns something about potential outcomes each time through. In his desperation, this must seem like a good trade. Like he'll tell Garfiel, "So long as I don't give up, there are no secrets." Very pragmatic, but a terrible match for someone like Subaru, who struggles with his self-esteem. Recall the previous section when we talked about how his impression of himself does not match up with others. The difference between how he is treated by people after successful loops versus the failed loops could lead him to believe that he is only valuable for the results that he can generate. And if his only worth is in the outcomes he can bring about, then any versions of himself which fail are basically expendable. Not a healthy mindset, but not much of a stretch for someone who already struggles with a low opinion of themselves. To make the situation seem more palatable, Subaru will justify his behavior by reframing it in more noble terms. As he'll say to Garfiel, "I'm the only one who needs to know hell. That's what I'm here for." This is Subaru recontextualizing his decision into something heroic. He isn't recklessly putting himself in harm's way because nobody cares about him until he succeeds. No, he's willingly sacrificing himself to protect others, to spare them from the burden of it all. That's what he's here for. It's his purpose, his duty. He'll bear the load because no one else can. He will go it alone for the sake of everyone else, a solitary savior. Now, doesn't that sound dangerously close to his first season delusions of heroism? Of imagining himself as the isekai protagonist who overcomes all odds? It's a different variation of Subaru. He's not doing it for the glory this time, but that temptation to lean into the isekai script returns. Only he, the main character blessed with summoned powers, can overcome. His personal fable is back in play. As before, the story does not reward him for behaving as though he were in a standard isekai. This time, though, the cost is more obviously centered on Subaru's mental stability and his relationship with others. As he leans even further into starting each loop, fully expecting to die, he naturally pulls back from the other people around him. After all, they won't remember any of this, and the less people involved, the less likely something else like Rem will happen. This is partially a defensive mechanism for Subaru, and partially the inevitability of looping through time. This emotional retraction by Subaru does not go unnoticed. Oto will point out that Subaru seems awfully calm considering the trauma that Emilia is going through. By all rights, Subaru should be a nervous wreck to have his mane squeeze in such a state, but he's already become distant from her struggle. The empathy gap between them is increasing as he repeats. He even laughs at himself for leaving her a letter when he leaves during one loop. It doesn't really matter what he says to her or not because he's planning to die and reset everything anyway. Roswaal will also comment on Subaru's lack of reaction when he kills Ram and Garfield in front of him. Roz, of course, knows precisely why he is so disaffected. Subaru figures their deaths can be undone when he rewinds the clock. They aren't really dying to Subaru, they're just temporarily off the board. Subaru was rapidly approaching the point that the versions of these people in all the rewound timelines are just not real to him anymore. This is why the second trial for him is so brutal. The unthinkable present is one in which Subaru is not rewinding time, but is actually leaving those people adrift or dead in other worlds where the timeline continues. They go from being memories that only he holds to very real people that he has helped traumatize. All that distance he was putting between himself and others collapses at once, and, he does not take it very well. But whether those visions were real or not, Subaru cannot continue to loop endlessly with no ill effects. He will amass more and more examples of his failure, while the people around him more and more will resemble scripted NPCs, whose dialogues and actions he simply needs to navigate toward the next variation. Even a healthy mind would eventually crumble under this, but Subaru is still kind of figuring things out. He can only convince himself to do this in the first place because of the low value he places on his life. He finally overcame the third arc by putting his ego pride aside, but now he has swung too far in the other direction. Egocentrism is actually an important development step, in part because of learning how to look after yourself. Too little focus on oneself is a problem just as surely as too much. It does no good to walk through 500 loops to find a perfect answer if the Subaru who comes out the other side is socially crippled, or if the people he wants to save become strangers in the process. He needs these other people. The outside perspectives of others help him be a better version of himself. But even though Subaru knows he needs the help of others, his ongoing insecurity makes him resist ever admitting that need, at least when it comes to his own state of mind. Asking for backup in the form of muscle or magic is one thing, but asking for sympathy, or understanding, or emotional support? He still resists showing that sort of weakness, and yet fails to account for how it makes him weaker still. This is precisely why Oto punches him at the end of Season 2's first half, and the reason that act prompted me to make this whole video in the first place. Hiding one's weakness is not a mark of strength, it's just an additional form of weakness. Subaru has made progress, but he is still a work in progress. and this reluctance to show his vulnerability is an ongoing issue for him as he wrestles with his insecurity. It's one of the recurrent sticking points between him and Emilia. In the second arc, he resisted the initial lap pillow and her attempts to get him to let out what he was feeling, even though it helped him in such an obvious way that Rem and Ram noticed it the next day. He feels embarrassed for showing that side of himself. At the very start of Season 2, when Rem's situation is weighing on him and Emilia offers comfort, he'll nevertheless ask her to turn around so that she doesn't see him cry. Sweetheart that she is, she'll embrace him anyway, but will keep her eyes shut to respect his request. When he later escapes from being drawn into Satala, he comes back visibly shaken, and for the only time in all the loops, it is Emilia comforting him after her first trial ends. Afterwards, though, he is clearly embarrassed. He'd rather not let her see that side of him. But Emilia isn't ashamed of him in the least. If Subaru could get over his desire to always look cool in front of her, he might have noticed the lovey-dovey eyes she makes at him when she mentions glimpsing this weaker side. I know I say this a lot, but loving someone means showing your vulnerability to them. It's a display of trust in them and an invitation for them to trust you in turn. But that kind of reveal is a rather tall order for those who are insecure. Far safer to guard that weakness, mask over it, pretend it doesn't exist. By being stuck in that mode, Subaru fails to see that the others want to see that side of him, want to help him. He's too worried that if they knew he was flawed or in need, that they would abandon him. This is why he couldn't understand what Rem meant in their conversation after Emilia left the capital. Finding him pathetic and yet wanting to stay by his side is not contradictory to her, but it is contradictory to him. Emilia basically says the same thing to him. I'm not going to hate you just because you showed me a moment of weakness. And this reluctance does not only negatively affect Subaru. Because his default is to avoid sharing his vulnerability, he doesn't understand how to invite others to do so. During the same time that he is getting more desperate, he is also failing to see what Emilia is going through and the kind of support she needs. Each of them becomes increasingly isolated, as she has no one to lean on but Subaru, and Subaru is busy spinning himself recklessly and pulling back from everyone around him. If this went on long enough, it might have come to a place where there was no going back. In fact, that would be the perfect time for someone else to try to step up between them. Almost as if that was by design. So to preface the next section, I want to mention our discussion before the second season began. See, back during the release of the director's cut of Season 1, we did a comprehensive rewatch on my Twitch channel to get ready for the new episodes. Some discussion, analysis, speculation, we tried to all get on the same page so we could make sense of Season 2 together, and this included that little "a moment in the carriage" stinger scene that concludes the director's cut. It's the same scene that is repeated at the beginning of Season 2. We discussed the possibilities for the story ahead, and there are two things from that which I want to bring up right now. The first was speculating what kind of story impact we might anticipate if other people knew that Subaru could return by death. While keeping it secret complicates things for Subaru, whatever force works to prevent him from talking about the power may be doing him a huge favor. Once his friends or allies know that he's been time looping and is effectively immortal, they probably will not be able to look at him in the same way. He has memories of interactions with them that they do not remember, which means he knows more about them than they realize. He's kind of an accidental stalker or voyeur, where he has an asymmetrical amount of knowledge concerning the people around him. He has basically known everyone else longer than they have known him. He even jokes about it with Betty, that he feels like he's known her 4 times longer than he really has. This could easily lead to suspicion or a difficulty trusting Subaru. How do they know what he knows about them? Did he root out their secrets in a past loop and is biding his time with that information? Has he seen them at their worst and is treating them accordingly? Has he done objectionable things and simply rewound the clock so no one would know that he has that capacity? Then there's also a shock in store for those who care about Subaru. Learning that he has put himself through the gates of death repeatedly will be horrifying to learn. Figuring out that he has done so on purpose at times may lead to anger toward him, or pity, or fear that he will do so again. And discovering that he died repeatedly to save some of them may threaten to drown them in guilt. Or, in the case of Rem, or Ram, or Otto, or Garfiel, how do they deal with knowing that they tried to kill him in other loops, or even succeeded? But there would also be a temptation to use Subaru for his power. Indeed, since he can't die, but everyone else can, How can he ever justify putting someone else's life on the line for a cause? We didn't need to lose anyone to the white whale or to the cultists. You just need to keep trying and dying until we skated through with 0 casualties. Imagine his allies strategizing for a showdown and future antagonists and not taking his immortality into consideration. It would just be bad policy not to put him in the most dangerous situations instead of someone else. And what if things go poorly all the same? Do others then try to beg him to die and reverse course? Do they actively just murder him if they don't find the present circumstances tolerable? In all that speculative musing, there was one thing that seemed clear. If people knew about return by death, they would treat Subaru differently, and probably not to his advantage. So, that was one story possibility we explored. The other I want to bring up was the reveal from that A Moment in the Carriage scene, where we discover that Rem has somehow been erased again. Now, all we could tell at the time was that Rem had been blanked out of Emilia's memory, and most likely everyone else's, and it was confusing, because we had only known about that power from the now defeated white whale. The existence of someone with a similar capability was yet unknown. For all we knew, she was dead, and the second season would be about the mystery of what happened. Or perhaps someone was holding her hostage, and the second season would involve Subaru trying to convince other people that Rem needs saving while they look at him like he's crazy. Or perhaps Satella was envious of how close Rem and Subaru had become and decided to erase the competition. It is none of these things, as it turns out, but that's not why I'm bringing it up. I mentioned our speculation from back then because of an argument I made about the story's structure. And although I had some fists shaken at me at chat for this, I suggested that it made a lot of sense to keep Rem off stage for the foreseeable future. If her situation could be reversed, it would not be in the near term. Now, this is meta-reasoning, but keeping Rem around could negatively affect the story, while her positive influence will persist even when she's absent. You see, Rem's presence kind of crowds things out a bit. Subaru won't willingly sideline her, but I couldn't imagine the storyteller minimizing her part in the story after going to such lengths to endure her to the audience. She's a major part of what happens in the third arc until just after the white whale is defeated. And just having her mill around in the background going forward wouldn't seem very consistent. However, the memory of her and the positive force she has been in Subaru's life can persist even if she is gone. That doesn't vanish even if she does. You could also argue that she already completed her character arc, as she goes from being the one most suspicious of Subaru to having her life changed by him to being the perfect person to support him when he needs his own course correction. She even has her romantic hopes dashed, and so that thread isn't left hanging either. So, to me, it made a lot of sense to keep her off stage, because that would allow someone else to share Subaru's spotlight. The most obvious candidate for this at the end of Season 1 was Emilia. She was mostly off stage herself throughout the third arc, which is what gives Rem space to become more fully fleshed out. If Emilia is indeed to be Subaru's main heroine and the de facto co-star, she's going to need to increase her screen time. Rem's absence provides a natural opportunity. In fact, the end of the very first episode of Season 2 seems to suggest this as a direction. Rem is literally present, but basically out of the story. It's clear that she'll be a motivating factor for Subaru going forward, and Emilia is right there in the same scene, supporting him in the same way Rem had previously. From there, the first half of the season progressed in a different direction, yet it still matched up with these two topics we discussed in anticipation. Rem's absence made space for someone else, alright, but it wasn't Emilia. And that same someone knew about return by death, and sure enough, that knowledge governs how they interact with Subaru, perhaps why they interact with him at all. I'm speaking, of course, of our butterfly-themed witch with her own brand of tea, Echidna. So, Echidna. Full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of her addition to the story, as I find her such an interesting character. It's difficult to tell when she is being earnest and when she is putting on an act, and she'll switch from confidently self-assured to charmingly out of sorts from moment to moment. It's also difficult to nail down exactly what her morals or priorities may be, masked behind her vast knowledge and her penchant for manipulating others. She can seem completely self-aware at times, and utterly clueless at others. And either of those states might just be an impression that she is cultivating on purpose. If you also enjoy this character, then strap in. This is the single longest section of the video. The first part of Season 2 I now think of as Echidna's Gambit. The thing she is trying to accomplish is to contract with Subaru, the one who holds the power of return by death. In retrospect, we can see and perhaps even admire the skillful way she tries to coax this outcome. It relies on three things: an engineered crisis to stress and isolate, an offer of relief and guidance amid said crisis, and of course, the parts of Subaru's personality that make him susceptible to such a strategy. But first then, Subaru is vulnerable to this ploy for the reasons that we have discussed at length. The time looping is inherently isolating, but doubly so when he can't explain what he is even going through to anyone else. Even if he could, his insecurity means he is reluctant to admit hardship. He still hopes to be the kind of person who saves the day, so he will try to shoulder the burden of finding a way forward. After all, he suspects return by death is the only thing that makes him special. But even though this has a personal cost, his low self-worth makes it natural for him to choose endangering himself over someone that he cares about. That doesn't just result in him denying others the opportunity to assist him. It means he is not in a position to assist them either. His social inexperience and the egocentrism he has not yet matured out of mean that he will struggle to understand what personal trials the others are going through, and without that, he can be of little use to them. But of course, even if he was equipped for that, he is distancing himself from them as he recklessly loops about. What a mess. He made progress in Season 1, but the loss of Rem and the responsibility that Subaru feels, rightly or not, put him in a very vulnerable place once things in the sanctuary start to go wrong. His personal shortcomings make the scheme more likely to work, but there is still a scheme afoot, and that is another part of Echidna's Gambit, an engineered crisis. Once we had the entire picture of Season 2 to examine, it's clear that Echidna and Roz were pressuring Subaru in a good cop, bad cop kind of way. Roz was the push, Echidna the pull. In each loop, when Roz speaks to Subaru, he's trying to ascertain what Subaru may have learned in previous loops, and in turn, he shares new information or makes new suggestions. Roz will eventually reveal that he withdrew from the mansion before the cultist attack on purpose, and that he is behind the hiring of Elsa and Mei Li for the new attack on the mansion, and that he causes the snowstorm which eventually brings the Great Rabbit to devour everyone. We can tell now that the things Roz says are not to help Subaru navigate the crisis, but to manipulate his state of mind. The goal, as Roz tells it, was to isolate Emilia so that she is dependent on Subaru, while pushing Subaru to abandon any concern save for her, with a willingness to do whatever it takes to advance her cause. Forcing him to choose Emilia over the lives of Betty, Petra, Rem, and Frederica would be a massive step toward molding Subaru into someone who will not blink at what is required to aid her. Once he has consciously let his own friends die for that cause, why would he object to something less serious in the future? It is a forced re-anchoring of Subaru's moral compass. In short, Roz wants Subaru to become like him, someone with no scruples about how they pursue what they want. The timing of the two events are further meant to make Subaru need to choose one over the other, to make it impossible to save both. What Elsa says about her instructions, though, also reveals that traumatizing Subaru was part of the plan. When Subaru shows up days earlier to try to get to the mansion before Elsa, she is there just the same. In fact, she is waiting for him to show himself as her own cue to begin the slaughter. Roz, who hired her, wanted Subaru to witness their deaths, to witness the futility of trying to reverse their demise. It's not just about killing them, it's about affecting Subaru's mental state. A diabolical set of instructions from Roz, carried out against his own household. But this is not really Roz's scheme. He doesn't know what will happen due to summoning the massive blizzard, though he guesses that others will blame Emilia for it. At the end of Season 2, we'll have it confirmed that his version of the Tome of Wisdom tells him to make it snow at a certain time, but nothing else. He carries out these directions without knowledge of what they may lead to. I think it's fair to assume that several of Roz's actions will match that same pattern, that all the necessary pieces for this crisis were instructions that he followed, whether he understood their purpose or not. He obeys blindly, and it's such a problem that Rama was willing to risk her life destroying the book just to free him. Considering how adrift he seems after her success, I would guess that quite a lot of Roz's behavior was directed for him. Roz is the one who takes the actions to put Subaru between a rock and a hard place, and Roz even directs Subaru's suspicions onto himself. But the person orchestrating events through Roz is Echidna, who is basically puppeteering Roz over here to make Subaru desperate, while holding herself out as a support structure for him. That, then, is the third part of her Gambit, and it not only depends on the other two parts, it gets a massive boost from what happens to Rem. So much so, in fact, that I'm at least partially suspicious that Echidna had something to do with Lai and Regulus's attack on the caravan. But whether that's the case or not, that event leaves Subaru without Rem's counsel or emotional aid. He is especially alone going into the sanctuary, and especially wary of risking others after he can't reverse what happens to her. Now, I think it's important to note that the impact of Rem's absence also reinforces how much of RE0 turns around Subaru's characterization. If you look at Season 2, almost none of the narrative proceeds from Rem having her name eaten. Like, that is not what causes Ram to bring half of the villagers there on Roz's orders, or Emilia to be invited inside the barrier where she is trapped, or the scheme with the assassins and the snowstorm, or the content of the trials, and so on. Maybe Frederica and Petra only end up involved due to Rem's absence, but it seems that Subaru and Emilia and Otto would have ended up in the sanctuary all the same, and the crisis would be similar. However, Rem's loss has a huge impact on the person of Subaru. His fear of further loss has a strong influence on his decisions. And since Subaru's decisions are what determine how each loop plays out, Rem's absence makes it easy to see how a psychological setback for Subaru can wildly alter all other destinies. After all, no one else is affected by what happens to her. No one else even remembers her. Elsa's hit list didn't even include her, and yet the ripple effect of Lai's attack encompasses everyone near Subaru, at least until he finds the way through. He just has to do so without the support of our stalwart maid. And it is just that vacancy in Subaru's life that Echidna tries to take for herself, summoning him to a tea party, giving him permission to take the trials, stabilizing his witch factor, showing off her vast knowledge, even a fair bit of flirtiness. As things get increasingly chaotic and confusing, and Subaru withdraws from everyone else, Echidna's little pocket dimension, with its green grass and blue sky, is like a port in the storm. She even has snacks, though make sure you read the fine print. She still has one more potent ace up her sleeve. She can offer Subaru something that no one else can, an opportunity to talk about return by death. Now, this was a standout moment for me in the series, as well as a great use of the episode break. Subaru realizes that Echidna meeting him again shouldn't make sense to him, that only he should remember their previous encounter. He is still reluctant to suggest what this may mean, and as she nudges him along to refer to return by death out loud, you can tell that the sharp memory of all the previous traumatic instances are rushing back to the front of his mind. When he steels himself to say it and nothing happens, all of the frustration and loneliness the prohibition has caused him comes pouring out in a torrent as he says it again and again. It's such relief that it brings him to his knees. When we watched this live, there was an overwhelming feeling of catharsis in Subaru reaching this moment. We felt relieved right along with him, appreciating the weight of this isolating burden all over again. The episode ends on that emotional high, with Echidna inviting him to retell his story to her in his own words, something he has not been able to do in all 33 episodes to that point. The next episode then picks up after he has spun his tale off screen and calmed down a bit. It's in what Echidna does at this point where you can see the scheme most plainly. She'll remark about being overwhelmed with rage towards the one who put him through this. She means Satala, but curiously, Echidna never says her name. Even back when she gave her introductions of the other witches, she names everyone except for Satala. There is a deliberate othering of our Witch of Envy. In fact, Echidna goes on to say that no one is capable of understanding how her mind works, and even if she could, she wouldn't want to. This colors the tone of the conversation they have about return by death, as Echidna has now framed it as the gift of a delusional madwoman. Echidna will suggest some other things about the power that lead rather directly to Subaru going down his reckless path of assuming that he must die repeatedly. She says that there is probably no limit to the number of times he can use return by death. She suggests too that the power doesn't take anyone else into account, that preventing Subaru's death is its only goal. Anyone else he prioritizes is immaterial as far as the rewind goes, and the state of REM gives him little reason to disbelieve. This leads Subaru to a decision, which he addresses towards Satila as though she were listening. "I'll use this return by death blessing you gave me until there's nothing left to use." There is a spirit of defiance in what Subaru decides here. If Satila wants to keep him from dying, but doesn't care about anyone else, well then, he'll show her. He'll die as much as he wants to save them. How do you like them, Appas, you witch of envy? The scene also mirrors one from the first season that we have previously discussed, when Felis's advice to him to think about how he can make up to Emilia leads Subaru to decide that there is something he can do, that he can make any problem go away. Even his expression and tone are similar, a kind of mad elation accompanying the decision to lean into return by death as a solution to his problems. Of course, we know this went poorly in Season 1, and Subaru should remember that. Yet Echidona's influence here, and the way she characterizes Satila's gift, leads him to a kind of a desperate spitefulness. Echidna makes yet further plays to influence him. She provides him with a possible answer to the problem of the killer bunnies by letting him meet the one who created them. But that leads to a bewildering experience, with not just Daphne, but Tiphon and Minerva as well. These three conversations were every bit as disorienting as all the complications Subaru is facing in the world outside, and again, Echidna seems like a refuge of sanity amid the madness. He'll tell her that he learned that she was the most normal of the witches, and she'll make it plain she is pleased with this. I'm not really sure, even now, if she's actually pleased, or just wants Subaru to have that impression. Either way, it works nicely in her favor to once again seem like the best option for him to rely upon. She'll conclude this whole conversation by setting up Petra's gift to become the means for him to escape from Satila's absorption, which just further reinforces for Subaru that the witches are crazy, but at least Echidna is looking out for him. That loop, then, is when he begins deliberately treating each run as expendable. He'll think about how it's the best starting point he's had, and he just needs to work out what he can test and what he can bring back. Oto will express concern over Subaru being out late one night, telling him that he can always talk if it will help. Subaru plays it off as a joke, but Oto insists he's being sincere, and Subaru will think that that is exactly why he can't tell him. It's Subaru's intent to keep anyone else from being involved in these disposable test runs. When he leaves the next morning, he'll leave a cryptic note for Emilia explaining his absence, but then even seems to laugh at himself for the effort, saying that he's in a world where it's assumed that he'll redo everything, so it doesn't even make sense for him to bother. He'll also demonstrate a disregard for his own life when Garfiel catches him on the way out, enough to surprise Garfiel when he realizes as much. And on the way, Subaru is thinking to himself that he simply needs to find out what is going on before he can deal with it. If he can just find out, he can even ask Echidna for help. So as you can see from that collection of Subaru's thoughts and decisions, the encounter with Echidna has changed how he is even approaching the crisis. It leads directly to him further pushing others aside, treating his life as completely expendable, and intending to rely on her if things become dire. Once he learns that she was pursuing immortality, he'll even conclude on his own that this explains her interest in him. Return by death makes him effectively immortal, and so in a way, they are kindred spirits. He's isolated and misunderstood and desperate, but has been guided towards feeling solidarity with our Witch of Greed. That's a very favorable situation for her if she hopes that Subaru will form a contract in the future, and it works so well against him because of the flawed parts of his personality, which she well knows because of observing him all along. And again, it's not like she is just being opportunistic. She is the reason he and Emilia and everyone else is in this bind in the first place. She encouraged the behavior that led to Subaru being isolated from others with only her to rely upon, which is, actually classic behavior from an abuser to isolate their victims. The whole Gambit is as though she set his home on fire and then showed up with a bucket of water. Then comes the time to make her play. Subaru will encounter a string of additional stressors. He'll learn about Betty's death wish in the face of her contract, and will watch her die without protest. He'll be returned to the sanctuary to encounter an Emilia who has lost her mind in his absence. He'll watch Roz kill Rom and Garfiel in front of him just before making it plain that he knows Subaru can reset and is intentionally trying to box him into a hopeless place. Thus, as soon as Subaru can, he will return to the graveyard and seek Echidona's help. Is it okay if I turn to you again? There are so many things I want to find out and get you to agonize over with me. He'll even show a willingness to pay any price, saying that he'll give her his life as many times as she wants, or his pride, or anything else. But apparently he wasn't yet desperate enough, because instead, he'll be subjected to the second trial and the succession of the unthinkable presents which heap his many failures on his head all at once. Echidna will send Carmela to rescue him from this, and so once again seems like she's looking out for him, but Carmela's appearance as Rem does not completely fool him. That bodes well for Subaru as far as keeping his mind together, but I'm sure being reminded that she can't be there for him in truth just emphasizes his isolation further still. He can't turn to Rem, and at this point, he can't turn to anyone else. Only Echidna remains. Even when he asks her why she keeps trying to help him like this, she'll have an opportunity to throw a little more flirtation at him. It's a little mean to force a girl to spell that out for you. From there, she pivots right into proposing the contract. The way she describes it makes it sound as though they will simply make everything she's been doing for him official going forward. He won't ever have to go it alone again when navigating the next crisis or the one after. He'll have someone who can take his return by death power into consideration and can help share the burden of it. He still knows far too little about this world, and Echidna is the surest cure for this ignorance. Plus, she might have the hots for him. That's gotta be a plus, right? Rem feels that way, and she was his best ally. Really, it's easy to understand why he starts to go for it. He is saved by two things, really: the intervention of the witches and the bond that he has formed with others. Minerva pops up to interrupt the contract itself. Carmela and Sekhmet will also arrive to cast doubt on the merits of Echidna's proposal, but it's interesting to remember that Minerva was there first, especially after her mysteriously emotional meeting with Emilia at the end of her trials. Why ever it is she does so, it will give Subaru an opportunity to press for further details, and a chance to have second thoughts. Then Echidna decides to lay it all out in something like a sales pitch. Perhaps it's because the other witches imply that Echidna is deceiving him by omission, but she seems to share everything she is offering and everything she desires, even crescendoing into the notion that this arrangement might be something like love. It does not have the intended effect. You'll criticize her thinking as shallow, that a relationship or partnership or love or whatever she is proposing is simply a matter of agreeing to use each other. Is that the extent of how you understand human relationships? And he'll say to her that she is incapable of understanding how anyone else feels. But this, I think, is critical for Subaru's evolution, noticing this about Echidna and being repulsed by it. You see, it's something Subaru does as well. In fact, there are echoes of Subaru's personality and struggles in the people around him, which is actually the focus of our next section. Some of them serve as an example, some of them serve as a warning. We will get to the rest then. Right now, let's look at the similarity between Subaru and Echidna. Subaru's utilization of return by death at this point in the story has become problematic. The intention to keep repeating, of trying to get certain reactions or tease certain information out of everyone else, using the fact that the loops give him a knowledge advantage over everybody else, all of that is not too distant from what Echidna has been doing all along. Like I said, Subaru's continued looping more and more resembled someone trying to navigate the dialogue options of a bunch of NPCs in pursuit of a good end. They were slowly becoming less real to him, and his own concept of who he was to them began to shift as well. He was in effect using them by offering himself to be used by them, as he pursued his own idea of how the future should unfold. When confronted with that kind of give and take in Echidna's sales pitch, Subaru does recognize that such a thing is not what human interaction and partnerships are supposed to look like. And then the thing that really sinks Echidna, something that demonstrates a clear difference between them despite Subaru's behavior. He asks her about Betty. After some clarification about how Betty got into her contracted state and the stasis of waiting for that person, Subaru will learn that Echidna didn't have a specific someone in mind. She was curious to see who Betty would choose for that role. The fact that Betty hasn't, and has been waiting on guidance for 4 centuries, just happens to be the path she took out of the available options. A raw deal, perhaps, and certainly more reason not to put your faith in Echidna, but at least she intended to give Betty some agency over who she chose. It's really about how Echidna feels when thinking about Betty's plight. There's no question that Subaru is tormented on Betty's behalf, feels helpless to save her or reach her, and wants some other life for her besides waiting so long that she wishes for death instead. But Echidna, who only set her on this path out of something like curiosity, thinks it's wonderful, like a scientist observing the result of an experiment, rather than a mother in anguish over the despair of her child. The fact that Echidna doesn't even realize why this would be a deal-breaker just confirms that Subaru's judgment about her is on the money. And while this is enough to sink her gambit, that isn't the end of the problems, whether outside this tea party or inside Subaru himself. The aid Subaru needs to take a step down the final path comes from a rather unexpected place. Indeed, this is one of the most shocking things that happens in Season 2, a conversation with the Witch of Envy. It was already a surprise to have Satila manifest earlier in the season, yet her behavior itself was not particularly shocking. She was a person so feared her name became taboo. Her few interactions with Subaru in Season 1 were brief, inscrutable, and hostile, and Echidna already suggested that she was incomprehensible. And so her filling up the sanctuary with some kind of miasma, killing Garfiel, taking off after those at the mansion, and the chanting throughout, did nothing to challenge the idea that Satila is some crazed enemy of the world. She would thus have been on the bottom of the list of people you would expect to give Subaru wise advice. Indeed, a relatively lucid Witch of Envy is a new development altogether. The outcome of this part of the tea party is that Subaru will change from being someone who is trying to do it all himself, shoulder all burdens, suffer all misfortune, into someone who is willing to trust in other people. The key to this trust, though, isn't that he needs to change his opinions of them, but his opinions of himself. As we've discussed, the Subaru has a lot of cause to feel unwanted. He was abandoned by his friends in his youth, and he felt like he could never measure up to those succeeding around him, or to his father's example. Coming to the new world didn't solve this at all, it's just piled on more examples. Being killed by the very maids he was trying to befriend, being rejected by the knights and Emilia in the selection ceremony, having people delight in the public humiliation he received at Julius's hands, being rebuked and even ridiculed by Kruj and Felis and Anastasia and Priscilla, having Otto push him out of the carriage to save himself, being killed by Puck after Emilia's death, being beaten and imprisoned and threatened by Garfiel, learning the little girl he thought he saved was the one who tried to kill him, having Roz beat him and admit to just trying to manipulate him, that's a lot. A lot. It's not hard to fathom why Subaru would feel particularly disposable or meaningless to those around him. Even with a lot of growth and corrective action, the memory of all those rejections adds up. Subaru's low sense of self-worth means he is more prone to internalize those rejections as a reaction to his lack of qualities, rather than attributing them to the misunderstandings or even flaws of others. It's hard for him to truly believe that others value him when he doesn't value himself, even without all those examples. We get a particularly heartbreaking demonstration of his true thoughts after Betty teleports him back to the sanctuary and he encounters Emilia in a disturbed state. She'll be affectionate. She'll fuss over him and cling to him, and she'll tell him that she loves him. But for a main character, Subaru is not particularly goal-oriented, but the closest thing to a main goal he has is to be with Emilia, to love her and support her, and earn her love in return. Yet this behavior from her is not a victory. He knows instead that she's been pushed to the brink, forced into relying on him. And to convince the others, he says this, because there's no way Emilia would say she loves me. Yes, I realize that Emilia is Captain Crazy Pants while she is saying these things, and so they aren't a good representation of how she really feels. The point is that for Subaru, her caring about him and confessing to him is proof enough all by itself that she is not in her right mind. It's not that Emilia probably wouldn't normally say she loves me, It's that Emilia would never say she loves me. It's like the stress of the situation strips back the front he normally presents to everyone, including himself. What he really thinks and really fears is that she will never feel the same way. But that insecurity does not end with Emilia. He suspects it applies to everyone. It's thus his disbelief toward his own worthiness that needs to change, and the encounter with the Witch of Envy initiates this internal shift. The scene has a lot of parts, but there's 3 main stages I want to focus on: the repudiation of his behavior, the crisis of his despair, and a revelation at rock bottom. While Satala showing up is what sets the stage, it is once again Minerva who kickstarts the disruption. Seriously, who is she? After Subaru recoils from Satala, he'll proclaim that he isn't accepting help from any of them, that he'll find a way to fix everything himself. But Minerva rebuffs him for this mindset, for not caring if he keeps dying and making others cry. Oh, so it doesn't matter what anyone else might be feeling, so long as he can tell himself that he's suffering the most? She'll further criticize his insistence on being the only one who suffers as cowardly, a way of thinking so twisted that it's downright vile. Subaru has rationalized his actions as sparing the others' pain, but in reality, he is disregarding their feelings, ignoring the heartache he inflicts upon his friends with his self-destructive behavior. This isn't just because he hasn't taken the time to understand them or what they would feel. He isn't devoid of empathy. Rather, the idea that others might suffer if they knew what he was doing is a fantasy that he can hardly believe. And then, more fantastical still, Minerva will end her part with an unexpected comment, that Subaru's mindset is really ungrateful to Satala. Up until this conversation, it didn't seem like the other witches would be a big fan of hers, what with the whole devouring them 400 years ago and all. But Minerva seems to think of return by death not as a curse, but as a gift, and the Witch of Envy not as some antagonist, but someone to whom he should feel gratitude. Well, to be sure, if Subaru is failing to consider how his closest friends would take his actions, you can bet that Satala's feelings are about the last thing on his mind. So, of course, he doesn't understand at first when she tries to urge him to love himself more, to treasure himself, to protect himself. It creates such dissonance for Subaru that it kicks off the middle stage of the encounter, the crisis of his despair. He's pretty taken aback that Satala, of all people, would be trying to get him to love himself more, and so he fires back. Okay, fine. Loving myself means I stop dying and rewinding, right? Well, what will even be left for me then? There's nothing I can use but my own life. As long as I get hurt more than anyone else, so I can protect them, no one else will ever have to suffer at all. I have to say, this is such a nuanced understanding of the complexities and contradictions in the mind of the insecure. It's impressive. The idea that self-sacrifice can actually arise from selfishness is counterintuitive. And so too, the idea that one can be selfish and self-destructive with no contradiction. It all comes back to that preoccupation with self that is such a constant feature of those suffering insecurity. Understanding why Subaru's behavior isn't the noble thing he intends also means grasping that such acts are not always rooted in heroism, but can instead come from a place of desperation. It's precisely because Subaru believes he doesn't have any other value that he leans so hard into spending himself. What's more, he presumes that no one would even object, as the next thing he says is it's not like anyone cares what happens to a loser like me, right? Earlier in this section, we talked about the worry of what would happen if other people learned about return by death, that they would no doubt view and treat Subaru differently. It turns out that Subaru is one of those people. He feels so otherwise useless that he has distilled his entire value down to that one thing. What a sweeping indictment of the Isekai pattern that is. And if that weren't enough, he second-guesses the victories he has managed. He'll trail off from his own tirade to express his regret over what happened to Rem. She is gone, and he'll think, if I had only been stronger, if I had put myself on the front lines without worrying about what may happen to me, I could have prevented it. If it somehow wasn't clear enough before now, that should make plain how the loss of her undermined the progress he had made in Season 1. Rem was injured taking part in his plan against the White Whale, a plan that could have been altered. If only he had killed himself until no one was hurt or lost. If only he had rewound the clock as many times as it took for a perfect outcome. Isn't it selfish of him to have accepted any other result when he alone had the power to try again? Well, maybe, if there was no cost to trying again. But there is. A considerable cost, as Season 2 bears out. There's a saying in mental health supporter circles that I think applies here. You cannot set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Not that such wisdom would get through to Subaru at this moment, as he sobs over how trapped he feels. Sekhmet will even pipe up to accuse him of acting like a little child, crying and trying to do it all alone. Thank you, Sekhmet. Very helpful. Not that she's wrong. If you've ever seen a toddler insist on doing something themselves and crying when they fail, you'll probably know how Subaru looks to her in this moment. But he's more than just a little desperate here. He's feeling more than just a little cornered, and so bites his tongue in an attempt to die and use that escape. There's a little tiffy among the witches as to whether they should prevent or allow his suicide, but as he bleeds out, Satola will draw closer and ask him this: why haven't you realized that you should be included among the ones you want to save? It should be so obvious. I think her exasperation should be familiar to anyone who's ever tried to shore up someone's failing confidence. How do you help someone with self-loathing to understand their own value? You just want to shake them and say, why can't you see yourself the way I see you? But truth is, you can't love someone enough to make up for the love they refuse to give themselves. Thus is Subaru again at a low point, and as he dies, he replays words from the trials in his mind, the failures, the pain he may have inflicted on others. This does indeed seem like rock bottom. He's lost Rem, he's isolated himself from everyone else, he's desperate to save others but without a path forward, his increasing reliance on Echidna has blown up in his face, he's got all these crazy witches fussing over whether or not to let him die, and, to top it all off, the one thing he felt made him special, his one ace, is now the thing he's being criticized for using. It's just not a good day to be Subaru. But as they also say in mental health circles, when you're at the bottom, the only way you can look is up. And so the third part, his revelation. Much like in the first trial, remembering words from his number 1 and number 2 girls cuts through all the other confusion. Once again, he is reminded of why he had started to change at all, to believe at all. No matter what else he can try to deny about himself, he can't pretend that he hasn't done some good for Rem and Emilia, that he mattered in some small way to the two that he cares about the most. And so he has a clarifying thought. I don't want to die. Minerva, as though waiting for just that signal, revives him with a headbutt of healing while shouting, "See? That's how you really feel." And I think she means in more than just this one instance. He doesn't want to die, period. He doesn't want to keep dying and rewinding and going through the toll it takes. He didn't know what else to do. He'll lay there a bit longer, still wrestling with these central doubts. Does his life really have value? Is there anything he can do besides die and repeat everything? And then with the classic sun breaking through the clouds visual, he'll timidly ask himself if he can really believe that the people he likes might also like him. It seems so simple when put like that, and yet can be so hard for one who is struggling with self-worth. But it would seem he has gotten over that hurdle for the moment. Echidna will try once more to contract with him, but this time he will refuse because he knows her path will require sacrifice. Instead, he has a different plan. He's going to look for some value he might have to others beyond his dying. If he can find it, he says, he has a feeling he can repay them in some way other than his death. And that, then, is the revelation he had at rock bottom, the third part of this critical juncture. It's quite the turnaround, and it came from quite the odd place. As a result of this scene, Asatola goes from seeming like the big bad or final boss of the series to someone largely sympathetic, and at practically the same time that Echidna goes from being Subaru's understanding supporter to an inhuman manipulator. We've reversed our understanding of two witches who, for some reason, are at crossed purposes, and Subaru has likewise upended his plans regarding himself. There's one last bit I want to visit just after Subaru wakes up outside. RE0 consistently uses its side characters to great effect, and this little exchange is a nice example. Subaru finds himself past the barrier of the graveyard, and when trying to discover how, learns that Paturasha dragged him outside despite the injury she suffered forcing her way in. Why would she do that at cost to herself? And Otto provides the answer. Leaping to save someone when you think they're in danger, saving them regardless of the risk to yourself, and smiling when they wake up? I believe the feelings behind that are the same, whether you're a human or a ground dragon. Subaru needs a moment to process that, looking at Paterasha, looking at him, still full of concern. And then, in a great directing choice, tears spring to his eyes before he even realizes it, before he can prepare to play it off. The truth caught him unawares, a bolt from the blue. He does then try to act cool about it, of course. He's still not really good at showing his vulnerability, but at least the lesson hits its mark. As he'll say to Paterasha, "You actually like me, huh? Never thought you'd be the first one I learned that from." A simple revelation, but perhaps all the more profound for how Subaru struggled to arrive at it. It's progress. But, as before, Subaru's confidence is built on shaky ground. In the meeting with Roz, in which he reveals that it was he who hired the assassins, threatens to upend that confidence once again. That brings us back to the thing which inspired this video in the first place, Oto punching Subaru. It also takes us into the second half of the season, and so I will let it take us into the next section. The Echoes in Others. The second part of Season 2 opens with an extended cut of Oto wrecking Subaru, as if knowing that a single sucker punch wasn't enough to satisfy the audience. Let's watch, shall we? As I said before, the original inspiration for this video was Oto slugging Subaru at the end of Part 1, and the given purpose for this was to call him out for putting on a tough front around his friends. And that got me wondering, why leave off there? Why is that the last impression they want us to have before the show goes on break? They didn't lack for climactic moments to end on, considering that the rest of that episode contains Roz admitting to hiring the assassins, and the first real conversation between Satella and Subaru. Really big events. So why end with Oto's righteous fists and words? Well, it puts emphasis on Subaru's relationship to everyone else, while also suggesting that the near future of the story will feature Subaru changing the way he behaves towards them. That is, he will need to put into practice the epiphany he had at the end of the witches' tea party. He'll get by with a little help from his friends. And as it happens, the second part of Season 2 actually shifts considerably away from Subaru compared to most of the rest of the work. It highlights something that has been present throughout, that a lot of Subaru's internal struggles have echoes in the people around him. Subaru is in over his head and is going to need allies, but many of those allies have problems as well. Now, this video is about Subaru foremost, so these will necessarily be abbreviated explorations. I already compared him with Echidna in an earlier part, where he rejects her idea of relationships being a process of using and being used in turn. But I wanted to visit the 4 people who get this extra focus in Part 2, as well as one more with whom we will begin, Rem. A surface impression of Rem early in the story might lead one to believe that she should have no complaints. A maid twin with enviable looks would check a lot of boxes for jealousy or desire. Being a powerful fighter with supernatural healing is no small thing in such a dangerous world. She has gainful employment in a luxurious manner, working for a powerful lord, while also being superlatively skilled at her job. A sister who truly adores her, who has had her back practically from the very moment of their birth. And though misfortune lay in her past, she had a comfortable present and a reliable future. Certainly, one would not assume that she was walking around thinking to herself, "Nothing I do is enough. Even if I overdo everything, it will never be enough." She grew up in Ram's shadow, unable to measure up. Because of how being twins split their Oni powers too, Rem knows that her existence keeps Ram from being as powerful and gifted as she may have been. She hears the whispers of the other Oni. She knows that she is being compared. She has her own imaginary audience. Only Ram encourages her to be her own person, and for a time, Rem even convinces herself that she's fine just walking behind her older sister, in her shadow. But her momentary delight at seeing Ram's horn come off reveals how she really felt, and the shame of that dogged her steps ever since. And thus, Rem's list of upsides matter little. She feels inadequate, that even her very best would still be less than what Ram potentially could have been. It is an unreachable ideal she has fixed on in her childhood, a point of comparison she insists upon, and to which she can never measure up. Falling short, she finds it easy to put herself in harm's way, to spend herself for someone else, because what other value does she have? Hey, does that sound like anyone else we know? Like Rem, Subaru's impossible standard comes from a family member, and is thus a rather inescapable point of comparison. He also listened to the whispers of adults around him as a child, and internalized a belief in his own inadequacy that led to desperate, even destructive behavior. And in neither of their cases was the person they failed to measure up to actually the one suggesting they do so. For each, this expectation was self-inflicted. So let's look at Rem's turning point. She's willing to risk her life recklessly to fight the mob beasts because of thinking of herself as merely a replacement, expendable. She isn't doing it out of affection towards Subaru, but out of guilt, as her hesitation in taking his hand reminded her of when Ram lost her horn. This isn't heroic sacrifice, it's self-flagellation. And thus, when Ram and Subaru show up to save her and are carrying her away, she actually is upset rather than relieved. Them getting hurt defeats the whole purpose of her going alone. She has to atone. And Subaru's savvy psychological trick is to headbutt her and call her dumb. Or, more importantly, show that he is upset at her. Upset that she tried to do it herself at great risk rather than working with the rest of them. They must immediately work together in that moment, though, to hope to escape. And Subaru opts to be the bait so that Ram can save Rem. And just as Subaru has frequently had trouble believing that other people would want to do anything for him, Rem cannot understand why Subaru is willing to do this for someone like her. The act itself is only part of what helps her turn the corner. Yes, someone unquestionably risking their life to save hers is a powerful statement that her life is valuable enough to save, but Rem's inadequacy is deeper than that. And so when Subaru awakens the next day, he finds a still uncertain maid by his bedside. Seeing that, Subaru says, "You always look calm, but you're not calm or collected at all, are you?" And that invitation is enough for Rem to spill her turbulent thoughts. She's aware she's an incompetent demon clan dropout, that she is inferior to Ram, that she wonders why it was her that got to keep her horn, why she was born at all. Subaru does two things in response. He points out that her impression of Ram is probably unrealistic, but that even if it wasn't, the one who saved him was Rem. He was saved because she was there. He's glad she was there. She may call herself a replacement, but he thinks she is irreplaceable. And then he shares the idiom about demons laughing when you talk about the future and encourages her to do so. Small, tangible things about the next day, such as the details of breakfast, focusing on what is next. As he puts it, looking forward to make up for all the time she's wasted looking back. Subaru's first trial played out in some similar ways. His sense of his best not being good enough, and his belief in his dad's impossible standard, led him to act in ways that he might not have chosen otherwise. The memory of falling behind, of being increasingly alone, of blowing his high school debut, these shameful feelings of his past froze him in place as certainly as Rem's did. And what had changed for him in the interim is similar too. Other people making it plain that he has value to them, giving him a reason to look toward the future. Subaru had pointed out to Rem that he doesn't know the idealized version of Ram with a horn, the person that she compares herself against. In his trial, he tells his father that he's fine now because there's a girl he likes, and one that said she loved him, and neither of them knows that he's the son of Natsuki Kenichi. Something I really want to stress is that Rem's crisis is relatively early in the series. She will pay it forward in the From Zero episode that we detailed at length, but Subaru will still be racked with inadequacy well into the second season. Couldn't he just remember the advice he gave Rem and take it for himself? Easier said than done, right? But Subaru is not alone in having a harder time internalizing advice than dispensing it. That is nearly a universal human experience. It's simply easier to see issues in others than within ourselves. It's why I think his rejection of Echidna is significant. Faced with an external example of using others, he recognizes how warped such a mindset is. That difficulty in taking advice is not restricted to Subaru within our story either. Emilia has that same issue, and like Rem, she has been shackled by her past. We will get to her last, though. Next up is another person with the same problem, Garfiel. The part of Garf's character journey that we'll focus on is somewhat brief in the story, the confrontation outside the graveyard. His problems overlap with Subaru and Rem in particular, and he has hang-ups centered around a parent and a sister, and for him, these map to a traumatic childhood and a fear of the future, respectively. However, it is actually Emilia who first tries to relate his experience to her own. They'd both been through and failed the first trial, the facing of one's past. Getting Garf to try again is the ultimate goal, and what transforms him into an ally, but they first must confront why he avoids doing so. Subaru has only part of the story, but it's enough to try to provoke Garfiel and draw out his own excuses, as Subaru talks about Frederica working to make a place on the outside, and trusting that Garf would be able to free the people here. He also accuses Garf of holding a grudge against his mother, and Garf insists that he wanted her to be happy. In fact, he believed that his and his sister's existence were the problem. They were in the way of his mother's happiness, and it's why she left him behind and exited the sanctuary in the first place. Here, then, is where I see some real parallels with Subaru. Garf says that he wanted her to make him believe that their sadness and loneliness served the purpose of helping her find happiness, that there was a point to their pain even if it served her self-interest. And he'll say that he wanted her to make him hate her. It reminds me of Subaru's trial, where he talks to his father about how he wanted them to say they hated him, that they didn't love him, reject him, throw him out, and make him give up. These are not identical situations, but what they have in common is their belief that an adversarial relationship, hating or being hated, is preferable to the confused state they are in. They feel isolated in their experience, and if it's going to be like that, then it might as well be a clear, clean isolation, a rejection in truth to match the feeling of being rejected. Like Subaru, Garfield felt completely alone, and likewise embraced the state rather than challenge it. He tries to take everything onto himself over seeking a change. He admits that he will try to prevent them going outside, because for a lot of them, nothing will ever get better. He will be a barrier in truth. He'll do it all himself. Beating Garf is a team effort, but that is the point. In fact, a silly number of people are involved if you think about it. Otto and Ram at first, Emilia relating to him, Subaru and Paturasha physically sparring. Even Puck is involved in de-transforming him, and he does so from within the stone that Frederica had lent. Bringing so many against him and succeeding cuts his mindset off at its knees. He had decided to believe in his own power to stand alone, and so it is just that power he must see the limitations of. So too was Subaru forced to face the shortfalls of trying to do it all alone with his return by death. In this part of the story, he is instead determined to accept the help of others, and determined to make Garf do the same. There is but one more step for victory, though. Introducing Garf to the almighty lap pillow. Oh, and I guess pushing him to retake the trial. Once he does, and understands more about what his mother really wanted, the last bit of his insistence on standing alone fades away. Subaru likewise could better understand his parents and his relationship to them by looking at them anew, and both are better able to face forward afterwards. While having Garfiel come with them to the mansion serves the plot obstacle of facing Elsa, it's just as important as a confirmation of his inner change. Leaving the sanctuary itself was a major step, but reuniting with Frederica is a true embrace of the future, the one that she had left to prepare. Fighting alongside her is a confirmation he has stopped trying to do it all himself, just as Subaru taking him on with the others was evidence of his own change. There is one more kind of amusing overlap here. Garfiel is 14. He's a middle schooler. All his invoking of idioms was him being the fantasy world version of a chuny. And so Subaru, with his own chuny ways, is actually relatable to Garf. Once he decides they aren't enemies, Garfiel shows visible signs of admiring Subaru, calling him boss, Taisho, impressed by his written declarations to Emilia, even if Subaru is embarrassed that he saw, not balking when Roz tries to provoke him, and instead making his own dramatic declaration of why he will follow someone else now. Congratulations, Subaru. You might have accidentally stumbled upon the one person in this world who will find your nonsense super cool instead of super cringe. Speaking of people who cringe at Subaru, let's briefly talk about Byako. Like everyone in this section, Betty is constrained by her past, but she, in particular, is actively, intentionally insisting on not moving forward. It's not a fear of facing what lay behind, as with Garfiel or Emilia, but a belief that nothing lies ahead. She shares her conclusion that the reason nothing further has been written in her tome is because that is where her future ends. That being the case, she would rather perish than continue. Considering her look of relief when Elsa kills her, this is not mere talk. Spirits cannot die on their own, it turns out. She does not have full control of her fate. She has seemingly embraced that idea to the point of hyperbole, looking only to the book's instructions for guidance, insisting that she must await that person who will one day come for her. She has externalized control of her life. And there's something really important in that to point out. Subaru makes several attempts to get Betty to leave without success. When he tries the last time, he has already learned that Echidna didn't have someone in mind when she made Betty wait for that person. It was a kind of passing curiosity with no thought of how it would impact Betty. And yet, Subaru does not bring this up. He does not try to dismantle the idea of a that person. In fact, he specifically says that it's not him, even when Betty admits that she would have believed it. Instead, Subaru focuses on her doing something because she wants it. In an earlier loop, he had asked her why she saved him and no other, and prevented his attempt to cut his throat with a broken tea service, whether all of that was written in her book. And though she insists it was, that's a lie. There's nothing in the book. She saved Subaru because she wanted to, no matter how loath she is to admit it. He knows this, and so rather than having her leave the mansion on someone else's terms, following the book or the belief in a that person, he wants her to choose of her own accord. He'll point out that if she wanted to shut him out for real, he wouldn't be able to come back over and over. His final tack is not to make her an offer, but to plead for her to save him. She is perfectly equipped to live on. She doesn't need his help. But she was afraid to live on alone, hurting and sad, and clung to the idea of a promised person for refuge. Choosing Subaru when he is not that ideal, then, is Betty releasing an external control of her life. As she is afraid, to be sure, citing Subaru's short lifespan, an understandable fear after her experience with Ryuzu Meyer, but Subaru is at last able to convince her that, despite all she said, she has been waiting for someone to take her away from there. That room, that life. Subaru, I think, well relates. As mentioned before, he told his father he was waiting and hoping that his parents would force him to give up, would snap him out of his depressive state. Even when he complains about his father's attempts to intervene, he largely goes along with him. He also liked the idea of externalized control. And yet, with time, Subaru realizes that he must make the decision to change. It is the memory of what he had chosen to do and the value in his new life that breaks the spell. It's not his father's intervention on its own. Betty wants someone to take her away, but what matters is that she chooses who it will be, and Subaru does not try to take the choice from her. Two shut-ins, both insisting they were fine, both lying through their teeth. I imagine they understand one another rather well, being so alike. And so, how about another person Subaru is alike? Our scheming Margrave Roswaal. In this case, Subaru does not much like the comparison. His overlap with Roz is much like that with Echidna, a warning about the kind of person Subaru could have become. That abomination of a snow sculpture the twins made was painfully near the mark. When we get to glimpse Roswaal's past, it begins with him meeting Echidna. She is beautiful to his eyes, and their very first encounter involves her saving him from the situation he was in. He decides that she is his number one, and hitches his fate to her, subordinating whatever goals he may have had to her own. His dream is to see hers through. I could rewrite that last paragraph with Subaru and Emilia's names instead, and little would change. Both Subaru and Roswaal fixed on a woman as an ideal to chase and support. Both imagined this as a romantic endeavor, and both did so without any encouragement in that direction from the girl in question. Roz will make that observation himself, that they both force their ideals upon the women they love. In pursuing those chosen goals, the similarities continue. Subaru's extreme lengths to spend himself, and the resulting disconnect we have well covered at this point, so we won't rehash. The way these choices were shaping Subaru is even called out by Garfiel at one point, that what pissed him off the most was Subaru's attitude, that his eyes looked just like that Roswaal bastard's eyes. Roz, too, sees them as kindred spirits. When Subaru reluctantly agrees not to tell Emilia about what really happened to set up the cultist attack on the mansion, Roz points out that deep down he understood that all is as it should be. He knew Subaru would make a fitting partner. It seems to be his goal, in fact, to mold Subaru into someone just like him. The day will come when you truly catch up to me, he says, after first revealing that he knows about return by death. Roswaal has an obsession, and has decided that no cost is too high to see it through. Having been at it for 400 years, Roz is much further along that path than Subaru, to the degree that he is self-aware of how it warps him. It's his intent to force Subaru to the same place, breaking him, kickstarting his own acceptance that the ends justify the means. To overcome what you must, the human heart is only a hindrance, so I will force it upon you. This then is a glimpse of where Subaru could have ended up. Given enough loops, enough distance from the others, enough devaluing of himself and whatever original goals he may have had. He loves Emilia, but does not think himself worthy of her love on his own, no less than Roz, who is not enough to hold Hector at bay, who thinks only of bringing Echidna back to try again. To Roz, his single-minded and unyielding resolve is proof of the strength of his wish, and points out that his actual time with Echidna was a much shorter span than the time that he has spent at this task. It is, in fact, mostly the idea of Echidna that Roz is in love with, an unchanging, perfect, and external abstraction that he can subordinate his will to. He believes Subaru to be the same, and even tells Emilia as much, saying the you he loves is the ideal that lives within his own mind. For part of the story, in fact, I believe he's right. Thus, he is unprepared for how Emilia responds. Subaru told me I was a pain in the ass. Well, that is something Roz would never say to Echidna. It's not the literal words, mind, but the implication that Subaru was treating Emilia like a normal person, someone on his level, a real girl, not a goddess. Dare say, a partner. Now, it is not Subaru that changes Roz. Let's give our pink-haired maid her due. But her scheme is to shatter Roz's delusion, his obsessive and self-destructive belief in the idea of Echidna that is represented by his copy of the Tome of Wisdom. So too, Subaru could not really hope to be a partner to Emilia so long as she remained more of a concept. So let's at last, then, talk about Emilia. Earlier, I mentioned how Emilia has spent a lot of time off stage in our story. Rem occupied something of the co-star spot for a time, and Echidna did so as well. We in the audience had not really been afforded much chance to know Emilia, especially if you discount the Frozen Bond OVA. We had more of an idea of her than a full rendering, especially in Season 1. Nearly every conflict involving her is an external one. I thus think it rather appropriate that she gains so much more exploration in tandem with Subaru's own increasingly realistic understanding of her. The audience is again forced into experiencing things as Subaru does. My favorite example of the disconnect between them is 10 episodes into the second season, when Subaru encounters Emilia walking alone at night. She has a kind of ethereal glow to her, a bright point in a darkened forest, and in his captivation, he declares to Emilia that she looks like a fairy. But she isn't flattered. She thinks he's giving her grief. To her, a fairy is an evil spirit. You won't fool her into thinking it's a compliment. That Subaru's impulse is to compare her to something of fantasy, and that such comparison is not what she would want, is a rather neat encapsulation of where they are, even at that late stage. Emilia, after all, has constantly been reduced to an idea instead of a person. She's a half-devil, the silver-haired half-elf, the witch's daughter, the frozen witch, the royal selection candidate, Roswaal's honored guest, or the key to the seal, she is at least one of these concepts to most of the people she meets, when all she wants to be is Emilia. Just Emilia. Subaru had a real advantage with his isekai start, coming in without any of the cultural bias that so many others hold towards her. But his very belief in the isekai pattern is why he fumbles this out of the gate. When we get to see his bedroom in the trial, it's hard not to notice how many of the figurines or posters feature girls with silvery hair. The man has a preference. Small wonder he would designate her his heroine early on, still believing he was living out a trope-filled fantasy. But for Emilia, heroine is just another of those ideas that she's being reduced to. When she and Subaru have their big fight after he made a spectacle of himself, one of the key things she says is, "I thought maybe you, only you, wouldn't give me special treatment." She wants to be looked at the way he looks at anyone else. Subaru intends the way he favors her to be an expression of his love, but he hasn't even gotten to know her well enough to understand what she would want that love to look like. He loves the idealized version of her, not the real her, and she knows it. As she also says in that fight, "The version of me that lives within you must be amazing." She can understand everything, even if you don't explain it to her. I think part of why this hurts her in particular is that she is, in truth, not as capable as she wants to be. She grew up isolated in another place and time, is missing memories from that past, lived almost entirely alone in the forest after being freed from the ice, and it seems has only recently been introduced to modern life. She is woefully inexperienced and unworldly, and therefore frequently naive. In some ways, she is like a child in how she sees the world. She knows this and is sensitive to it. To be fussed over or coddled, then, is not affection for Emilia. It's a reminder that others think she cannot manage on her own. It is shoving her back into the princess room, safe but alone. A good example is the final successful loop at the end of Season 1. Subaru's plan is to completely sideline Emilia with the help of Petra and the kids. This, even though he witnessed firsthand that she could wreck Betelgeuse on her own. He puts her in a box for safekeeping. It's fitting, then, that this actually puts her in extreme danger due to the hidden explosives, as though the world continues to punish him for acting like he is a typical isekai protagonist, with Emilia merely his damsel in distress. Now, I realize that Subaru has literally watched Emilia die multiple times, but remember that the same goes for Rem. It didn't stop him from making our Oni maid a crucial part of the White Whale plan. It's Subaru's designation of Emilia as the girl he needs to protect that's the issue. And it's an issue because it's the opposite of what she wants. There's 2 points in the second season in particular where this is plain. The first is when Subaru recommends to everyone that he take the trials instead of Emilia. And worse, he does it without finding out how she'd feel about the suggestion. While he posits that he makes the suggestion because it looked like she was in such pain, she takes it that he doesn't trust her with it. Remember, this comes after Subaru presented her to the villagers as the one who would save them, a public endorsement that everyone should have faith in her. It was a duty she accepted and treated seriously. As she'll say, if she turns her eyes away from things she doesn't like, leave them all to him and run away, what would be left for her then? This is all the more egregious because of a rewound conversation that Subaru at least should remember. After the first instance of the first trial, where he has passed and she has not, they will be discussing her trying again, with Subaru encouraging her. She'll say that she knows this is her duty, and then these key words: "Don't spoil me, just believe in me." Even if Emilia doesn't remember that conversation, it is how she really feels, and Subaru has little excuse to have forgotten. It's a little surprise that she feels like he yanked the rug from under her. He is doing precisely what Roswaal later encourages him towards before the mid-season break. I expect you to possess the will to carry out your objective, even if it means trampling on Emilia-sama's will. Like I said a bit ago, Roz's similarities to Subaru serve as a warning, the person he does not want to become. The all-important Oto Punch comes just after that, and Subaru's turnaround begins. Thus, when we get to the second point I mentioned, things go differently. This is when Emilia seems to lose Puck, dreams of Fortuna, and wakes to find Subaru absent despite his promise. She runs and hides herself in the graveyard, causing a crisis as everyone sets about to search. When Subaru finds her, he says he's not angry at her, but that is actually the problem. She knows she did something selfish, something that caused trouble. If he's not angry, isn't it because he didn't expect any better from her in the first place? To Emilia, his demeanor is like someone finding a lost child, more relief than anger. She'll say it plainly. You're kind to me even when I mess up because you're not even disappointed in me, right? He is spoiling her rather than believing in her, or so it at first seems. From there, the two of them fight, but for a change, it's a fight where both are trying to understand and be understood. We won't go blow by blow, but the important development is what Emilia relates to Roz, the thing that so shocked him, that Subaru can find fault with his heroine. Loving little things about someone else, even the things they don't feel confident in, that's one thing, and something we already got at the end of Season 1. But acknowledging their faults as faults, yet loving them still, is something else. It's hard to trust in someone's devotion if it seems they don't have the full picture. There's a belief that if they knew all the warts and scars, then surely they would feel different. That Subaru would detail her bad points, express his own frustration, and insist on his love all the same is a more romantic gesture for Emilia than any dashing rescue or thoughtful gift. This isn't out of the Isekai playbook. This is how actual relationships work. Fights are not a symptom of a failing relationship, but an attempt at a cure. Lack of communication is what kills any and all romance, and a fight is nothing if not an acute form of communication. Having the spat lead into their first kiss is thus an endorsement of its authenticity. Even Subaru warning her, giving her a chance to dodge rather than just planting one on her, marks an important change. He is making sure he does what she wants, not just what he thinks she wants. And then Subaru will really put his money where his mouth is. After they confront Garf and it is Emilia's turn to re-attempt the trial, Subaru leaves. He doesn't wait around to encourage her if she fails, or congratulate her if she succeeds. He wants to, hopes that their little errand with Roz will let him make it back before she comes out of there all proud. But when he gets the unlooked-for boon of Garf being able to leave the barrier, he goes about all the other things on his list because this one can be crossed off. He doesn't have a backup plan for the trials because he doesn't think he needs one. When Emilia emerges victorious, she does act a little put out that he isn't there, but it's fleeting. After all, what could be better evidence that he trusts her to it? Rama will be waiting instead, and she, too, will express faith in Emilia. She bows her head and tells her it's the first time she's ever meant it, and then entrusts Emilia with her most heartfelt desire, begging her for help to save Roz. From there to the end, it is one Emilia victory after another, standing her ground against Roz, clearing 2 more trials, breaking the barrier, protecting the villagers against the Great Rabbit. Emilia is, in fact, quite capable, and yet for so much of the second season, she seemed lost, uncertain. And this development isn't at odds with her characterization or a convenient source of story complication. She behaves this way for the same reason that she so values being trusted. Emilia is insecure. Emilia, like Subaru, is plagued by a sense of inadequacy. In fact, out of all the characters in the cast, I believe Emilia is most like Subaru in this arena. Despite how vastly different their pasts, their capabilities, the paths they have trod, each nevertheless is weighed down by issues over self-worth. 2 starting points far removed from one another have arrived at the same destination. How very pervasive insecurity can be. And once you start looking for such comparisons, they quickly add up, far too many to list here. Like Subaru, Emilia constantly talks down about herself, lists the ways in which she falls short. Like Subaru, she hides parts of herself, worried what others might think. She has trouble believing that the people she likes might like her in turn. Like Subaru, she puts herself in harm's way, reckless with her own safety. Just as he does, she chafes at not being involved, at being made to sit aside. What value does she have if she is not contributing? She also feels scrutinized, in the spotlight, and while it is more true in her case, it's the effect it has on them that is so similar. She, too, will put on the brave face, will use insincerity as a shield. It's hard to even remember now, but in her first encounter with Subaru, she acted in a way that seems like a different person from the story present. Sharp, almost prickly, and yet undermining the whole bit with her helpful actions and the over-the-top way she tries to insist that no debt is owed. It is self-defense, keeping others at arm's length. Even later, when she gives her name as Satila, now seems like another attempt to push him away. It may be fair to assume that this is how she normally behaves with strangers, but she helps them all the same. And this is another important thing the two of them have in common. They're kind. They lend a hand to others in need. Emilia helps the appa vendor's daughter even in the loop without Subaru, despite her hurry. She heals Romji even though he and Felt stole from her, giving the same kind of justification she gave for helping Subaru when they met. She'll even be tender with Felt when she is worried over the old man. In the frozen bond, she willingly makes herself frightening to the villagers to keep them from risking themselves in the woods, guaranteeing that she remains ostracized and alone. She still wants to save the people of Arlam even after they spurned her. I realize that sometimes the urge these two feel to help is bound up with their insecurity and sense of worth, but that is not the totality of their motivation. It's established that Emilia is repeatedly traumatized by the first trial, shaken by the experience until she finally overcomes. But in one loop, just after Subaru had been swallowed by Satila and killed himself free, he is the one who is shaken. And when Emilia comes to, ripped from the nightmare of her past, she notices his desperate state. She ends up comforting him despite the comfort she needed. Seeing the pain of another, she forgets her own. And this is all the more noteworthy for how often she is the one cursed or reviled by others. The world is supremely unkind to her, but she does not become unkind in turn. So too did Subaru resolve himself to save the two maids who demonized and killed him. He rescues Oto, who once left him for dead, to save himself. He challenges and then supports Garfiel, in whose hands he suffered much. And in writing about these many similarities between Emilia and Subaru, I realized this video needs another section. I've gone through great lengths to deconstruct the character of Subaru, to render him down to his constituent parts. Now, all these pieces must be brought together. Subaru must be reconstructed alongside the ideas that he helps us explore. And so we move on to the final section, the self-proclaimed knight. For this last part, I first have a confession to make. I did not start out writing this video with a grand argument in mind, no central thesis to support. I was fascinated by Subaru and how the complexity of the time-looping story is matched by his tempestuous inner life. But increasingly, as I wrote and thought and wrote some more, an idea emerged that I found even more compelling, and one that ties so much else together. It started when working on Emilia's section, as I just noted. Who she is before the events with Pandora seems a far cry from the Emilia that we have known throughout the story. She went through something incredibly shocking and suffered further still during the time portrayed in The Frozen Bond. And yet, there can be an upside to such hardship. Emilia was just a kid, sure, but she was well on her way to becoming a brat, fussed over and coddled, a little princess. You need look no further than some of the other candidates to see how she may have turned out. But having her comfort ripped away, losing everyone she knew, including herself, being punished and ostracized just for how she looks? Well, I dare say that will cure spoiled behavior in no time. Alongside the trauma and damaged self-esteem, though, she also developed into someone whose first instinct is to be kind. She who had so seldom been shown kindness now well appreciated its value. Thus, too, with Subaru. As I pointed out earlier, he largely does not harm others with his behavior. He is not the kind of insecure that tries to belittle people, to bring them lower that he may feel higher. Even during his many angry outbursts, he almost never attacks the other person's sense of self. He does not bully or degrade them. What judgment he casts is almost always towards actions, not the people who take the actions. He knows intimately the pain of feeling like one is not enough, and is resistant to inflict it on another. Now, I used qualifying language there because it does sometimes happen, and one really standout example springs to mind, when Subaru denigrates the Imperial Knights during the royal selection. Yes, I know, I'm sorry to inflict trauma on you by bringing that episode up yet again, but it turns out to be even more key than I originally thought. The name of that episode is Self-Proclaimed Knight Natsuki Subaru, and that moniker is used again later when he and Julius team up, in an episode titled The Self-Proclaimed Knight and the Greatest Knight. And now, at the end of Season 2, Subaru is being knighted in truth. How are we to read this? As I thought about how to answer that, I realized that Subaru possesses a certain quality. A quality that is, perhaps, the most important thing a hero needs. I think the scene where Subaru craps on the other knights is important because the very thing he accuses them of is that they didn't earn their knighthood status, that they were just acting like big shots with their daddy's name. Ironic, in hindsight, considering what we now know about Subaru living under the shadow of his father. What strikes me is that accusation, that they were knights because it was handed to them, is the very one we might level at many isekai heroes. They inherit some kind of gift as compensation for their rebirth, or are imbued with power as part of a summoning ritual, or they simply bring the information that they osmosed from our world with them. It is very different from the protagonists of, say, Battle Shonen, where a large part of the work is us watching the main characters struggle and strive to become stronger, to make a convincing case for why they will be enough to overcome all that is set before them. And yet, Subaru does not fit that mold either. If you think back to all the ways each crisis has been overcome, it is never Subaru's own power that wins the day. He hasn't become some great fighter or mage. It's Reinhard's insane strength that drives back Elsa. It's Rem's unleashed Oni side that saves the village. It's Kruja and the Iron Fang whose forces bring down the White Whale. It's Julius who slays Betelgeuse, with Satella and the Gospel finishing the job. It's Wilhelm and surviving warriors who overcome the remaining cultists. And then it's Garfiel and Frederica who deal with the mansion assassins, while Emilia and Betty wreck the Great Rabbit. Even when Subaru is involved, it's in some kind of supporting role, whether sharing sight with Julius, or playing bait for the Mobbeasts, or playing bait for the White Whale, or playing bait for Betelgeuse, or playing bait for the Great Rabbit. What kind of knight is that? What kind of hero is that? The knights in this world earn that status, precisely why they are so offended at Subaru's arrogance. As Julius says, have you worked hard enough to stand here? Have you done enough service to shame us? And Subaru does not even try to argue that he has. So, what would make him worthy now? While it has not been Subaru's personal strength that prevails, all of the powerful people who do so are in place because of him. And yes, sometimes that is thanks to his return by death power. That is frequently how he pulls it off, but that's not the important part. What's important is why those people agree to be involved. They don't know about return by death, that he's been save-scumming his way closer to a solution. They are not banking on some kind of cheat power. They are there because something else entices or inspires them. And after all the time I've spent covering the show and working on this video, all the time pondering our hapless MC, I find myself led to one conclusion. They are there because Subaru is a hero. A bold claim, I know, after I've spent all this time exploring how unheroic he can be. What do I even mean with such a word? Let's work with a simple definition I think we can agree on. A hero is someone who saves the day. They make possible the happy ending. We should consider then, what would be required to do so? If being summoned to another world is not the first step on that journey, then what is? Is it strength? The power to eliminate the threats to others? Is it bravery? The willingness to face great peril despite the odds? Or leadership, to be the one others rally behind? Is it confidence? Loyalty? Determination? Good answers all. Most who we would call heroic possess several of those qualities. And yet, many could just as easily be applied to capable villains. I've been thinking then that there's something else, a part that comes before. Maybe what matters isn't the ability to save. Maybe to be a hero, the first step, the most important step, is knowing who needs to be saved. The people closest to Subaru and most critical to his success are the very ones that he has saved. And not with strength of arms or brilliant strategy. He does so by recognizing their need. He gets involved with Emilia after concluding that she is going to waste her whole life with her reckless selflessness. In Rem, he sees someone chained by a belief that she can never measure up, can never compare to another member of her family. In Wilhelm, he sees someone tormented by regret, who needs another chance to say what needs to be said. And in Garfiel, he finds another soul afraid to move forward, who would rather seek enough strength to go it alone than ever ask for help. Even Rama. When she is being vilified by the others for still standing by Roswaal, Subaru does not join in. Just because she's down to go to Clown Pound Town is no reason to condemn her. And how could he, when he has decided to love the silver-haired half-devil whom the whole world shuns? And Betty. Betty. During our live stream discussions on Season 2, we all knew that convincing her to leave the mansion for the sanctuary must be the solution, but how could he do so? And for all our speculation and guessing, not a one of us realized what was obvious to Subaru at a glance. That always waiting by the door is proof that she was hoping for someone to take her away. Of course he would notice, when he had been hoping the very same thing. Betty and Rem and Emilia are all there in the same mansion together, and none of them even seem to see the other's pain, or if they do, they are unable to help. And yet all three have shown the capacity to save others, have saved others. Even as often as Subaru's egocentrism clouds his sight, there comes moments when his vision clears and he beholds another's misery. And once seen, he does not unsee. Once he holds out his hand, it stays out, no matter how improbable or costly. After all, who in all creation confronts Satala, enemy of the world, and says to her, "I swear I am going to save you"? Well, who else? See, Subaru does not possess some great insight, nor is he able to read minds, and I think we can safely rule out great social skills for why he knows how they're hurting, the things they need. It's much simpler. He recognizes them from his own reflection. Subaru is not a hero in spite of his shortcomings, but because of them. And now let us return all the way to the beginning, to some of the first things we talked about in this video. Subaru is a mess of a character, and the ways his flaws manifest can frustrate and annoy an audience. Sometimes, too, he is hard to bear for being alarmingly familiar to ourselves. Our reactions to him are perhaps not unlike how others have reacted to us. Even if he did not get to walk the typical isekai path, he is nevertheless a lot like the typical protagonist. And part of isekai's enduring appeal is how many in its audience can relate to such characters. How many also feel inadequate or ostracized or hopeless, or even just a general malaise. Who, understandably, dream of having it all change in a flash, of being powerful, recognized, loved, of truly feeling like the hero in their own story. ReZero has not delivered this dream easily, is perhaps even critical of the idea that it could be easy, that the path of least resistance could lead anywhere at all. And yet, I don't believe this is all it is doing. In fact, there's one way in which being an isekai now pays dividends, that crucial defining detail that the protagonist is someone from our world, someone like us. In all this time, Subaru still defaults to wearing his tracksuit, the uniform of shut-ins, a subtle but constant reminder that he was just a guy who had given up. The biggest hurdles he faces are not those of a fantasy realm, but the ones he brought with him. You can read Subaru's struggles as ones the audience may share, and his growth as a message to that audience that they can be overcome. But I think that is still stopping short. It is not just that Subaru is succeeding, but the way in which he does so. Not with his power. Return by Death didn't make him a hero, it very nearly made him a villain. Rather, it's his weaknesses that define him. For even though they frustrate us and frustrate other characters, it is how he gained the experience to know where he is needed. They are not a liability, but an advantage. What do the strong know of the weak anyway? And so, perhaps, beginning from a low point in any life should not be thought of as a source of shame, a flaw that one dreams of magicking away. Your starting weakness is not some unfortunate thing to be discarded, and it's not just a measuring stick to show how far you've come. It is how you will know who needs to be saved. Season 3 is bearing down on us, and I have no idea what the full scope of our narrative will be. We will cover it on stream like we have before. And once all is said and done, I will not be surprised if this series ends up being a roadmap out of a dissatisfied life, out of insecurity, out of the belief that one is not enough. And while not every story has or needs a message, I feel like we've been given several. Don't insist on being the hero, and don't insist on being the martyr. Be kind, especially to yourself. Do not chain your future to your past. Learn how to trust, learn how to be trusted. It is easy to give up, but it doesn't suit you. Lend a hand, lend an ear, hope for better, ask for help, and earn your happy ending.